Ladies and gentlemen, we ask you to please kindly take your seats. Our program is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Zinat Rahman, Executive Director of the University of Chicago Institute of Politics.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. And welcome to Disinformation and the Erosion of Democracy, hosted by The Atlantic and the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. Here at IOP, our mission is to foster in our students a passion for public service, meaningful dialogue, and active engagement in our democracy. And to instill that democracy is not a gift to be taken for granted, but an ongoing project that requires vigilance and commitment. Part of this mission is to safeguard the principles central to the strength of our democracy. And this conference is motivated by the growing evidence that disinformation, turbocharged by social media algorithms and manipulated by malign actors, is a threat to democracies everywhere. But we're the Institute of Politics and we're in the business of hope. So our goals for this conference are to focus on the scope of the problem, its sources, but also its potential solutions. And so for all of you students in the room and those joining the conference virtually, you're the next generation of leaders in public service, and we want you to pay special attention to the potential solutions raised over the course of this conference. We hope that for some of you, this conference motivates you to take action on this issue as you advance your professional journeys. Over the next 3 days, we'll hear from some of the foremost experts in the world on topics like what happens when we can't tell what's real, disinformation and the subversion of elections, defending free speech in the mobile internet age, and imagining a better social media. That's just a little snapshot of all of the panels we have. Then in a few weeks, we'll be hosting an ideathon for students to put their ideas into action on this issue. In planning this set of discussions, we knew that we needed a strong thought partner. And we could think of none other than The Atlantic, whose writing and thought leadership on disinformation are unparalleled. And we're so grateful for your partnership on this conference and your thought leadership on this issue. Thank you. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to the Bentivoglio Family Fund, the Joyce Foundation, and the Crankstart Foundation for supporting this conference and for bringing it to life. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Paul Alivisatos. Dr. Alivisatos is the 14th president of the University of Chicago and the John D. MacArthur Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Chemistry, the Pritzker School of Molecular Engineering, and the college. A preeminent scientist and entrepreneur, his pioneering research in the field of nanomaterials has demonstrated key applications of nanocrystals in such areas as biological imaging and renewable energy. His inventions are widely used in biomedicine and QLED TV displays, and his scientific advances have yielded more than 50 patents. Prior to commencing as president in September 2021, Alivisatos served as executive vice chancellor and provost of the University of California, Berkeley, and held a number of positions at Berkeley prior to that. And an alumnus of the college, Alivisatos earned his bachelor's degree in chemistry in 1981 and his PhD in chemistry from Berkeley in 1986. And as the president of University of Chicago, he is focused on deepening the university's connections and engagement both locally and internationally, and in finding new ways to connect the university's culture of academic rigor, open discourse, and impactful discovery with the complex challenges that we face as a global society. Please join me in welcoming President Paul Alivisatos to the stage.
Thank you so much, Zinat. And allow me to start by thanking the Institute of Politics. I'd like to thank you, Zinat, for everything that you're doing, and I'd like to especially acknowledge David Axelrod. David, what you have done to help create the environment of the Institute of Politics has been so remarkable. It has done so much to help this university, and you have taught me so much while I've been in this role. I'd like to especially welcome our partners from the Atlantic today. It was a real thrill for me actually to get to meet some of you because I am a subscriber, and actually every night, actually, when I'm doing my kind of media downloads, there's a whole bunch of Atlantic articles in there, and I love reading them. So I felt like I was, I'm a groupie right now. So to acknowledge Editor-in-Chief Jeffrey Goldberg, as well as Adrienne LaFrance, Ellen Cushing, and Emily Gottschalk McCarney. Thank you all for being here. It also gives me great pleasure to acknowledge our alumnus from the college, Aaron Simpson, who is a current Institute of Politics Pritzker Fellow and who has played a big role in thinking about a seminar series entitled Disinformation USA, a socio-technical reckoning on where we go from here. It speaks to the power of UChicago education that she has brought that forth. It is no accident, I think, that this event is being held here today as democracy is being challenged and the very fabric of how we access information and learn is so much in threat. This university is a very special place. In fact, when William Rainey Harper founded the university, he founded it on certain core principles which are held fast to this day and which make the university the special place that it is. I'm calling out specifically his insistence on academic freedom and freedom of expression, and how he called those out as the foundational principles by which it's possible for a faculty, no matter which topic they are studying, are able to struggle to find the questions and to argue in order to arrive at a better understanding of the truth or of what underlies every situation, whether it be a question of politics or a question of physics or chemistry. The academic freedom and freedom of expression are the core values. They are the essential values that enable a university to thrive. And so I do think it's very special that this event is held here today. Another thing that William Rainey Harper deeply believed in, and which is greatly motivating to me, is he imagined what I have been calling the engaged university. From the very first day of his presidency, he conceived of the university as tied to the fabric of society, even as we thought about the deepest and hardest problems that humanity can imagine. At the same time, he cared very much about the university being an engaged partner. So today we have many partner institutions here, and we are grappling with an issue that our global societies all must approach, and on which we have so much to learn. It is actually also a little bit of a personal topic for me. Some of you may know that I had the difficult experience as a teenager of growing up in a military dictatorship, the junta in Greece, during my teen years. And I vividly recall the experience of being in an information lockdown. We knew as students that we didn't know what was happening. That was something everybody took for granted. We just knew that we didn't know. But we didn't know what we didn't know. We had no way of knowing it. Except occasionally I had the privilege, just because of the type of family that I was in, that every so often somebody would go abroad, and when they would come back, they would bring magazines with them. So occasionally, I still recall as a 13-year-old having a copy of Time magazine, which was our source of information. And the stories in there were just so completely contradictory to what was in our own media that it was astonishing. And that was how I experienced the complete information lockdown. Of course, the struggle between freedom of information and control and misinformation is as old as human societies, and it's constantly changing. And so today we're in a world where the internet, social media, and other aspects of it remain new challenges for us that we have to explore, even as we see that kind of brute force methods that were used during my adolescence also are used with devastating effect. So it's a huge topic for us today, and it's one where I'm really looking forward to being informed and to learning as much as I possibly can. It gives me enormous pride to be able to introduce the next speaker, Maria Ressa. She is a heroic figure, a journalist in Asia for more than 35 years. She co-founded Rappler, which is the top digital-only news site that leads the fight for press freedom in the Philippines. As Rappler's CEO and president, she has endured constant political harassment and arrests by the Duterte government. She has been forced to post bail 10 times to stay free. And her battle for truth and democracy is the subject of the 2020 Sundance Film Festival documentary, 1,000 Cuts. In October of 2021, she was recognized, she was one of 2 journalists who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition for her efforts to safeguard freedom of expression, which is a precondition for democracy and lasting peace. I think you all know that her co-recipient, Dmitry Muratov, his Novaya Gazeta was recently silenced. Among her many awards for her principled stances include the Golden Pen of Freedom Award, the Knight International Journalism Award, the Gwen Ifill Press Freedom Award, the Shorenstein Journalism Award from Stanford, the Free Media Pioneer Award from the International Press Institute, and the Sergei Magnitsky Award for Investigative Journalism. Maria, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the stage.
Thank you, thank you. Nice to be, it's so wonderful to be here. I asked if I could bring my cell phone, and I was told yes. But, you know, when I was walking over, I was like, the air feels different, because it really does. In order to get here, I had to get court approvals for 7 criminal charges. And I wasn't sure I could get here, but I'm so thrilled to be here and to see so many friends. So I'm going to be quick, because you really want to hear from Adrian, and you know it. But thank you for allowing me and for listening, allowing me to be here. So for us, we're 33 days before our presidential elections. Filipinos are going to the poll, and we are choosing 18,000 posts, including the president and vice president. And how do you have integrity of elections if you don't have integrity of facts? That's a reality that we're living with. All right, so here's what I'm going to try to do. I've put all of this stuff together in a book, and this is part of the reason you'll see these ideas over and over. And the question I really want to ask you is the question we had to confront. What are you willing to sacrifice for the truth? Because these are the times we live in. The prologue for the book, which I pushed in last year, at the end of last year, right after the Nobel awarding, was, you know, the prologue started with Crimea and the annexation in 2014, because that's when you began to see the splintering of reality that had geopolitical impact. And of course, I've had to revise it once Russia invaded the Ukraine. And the question that goes through my head is, if in 2014, i.e. 8 years ago, we did something about it, would we be where we are today, right? No, we wouldn't be. So here's what I'm gonna talk about today, like really just 3 things. What happened? How did it change us? And then the third is, what can we do about it? Because these are critical for me. It's existential. You know, I call it an Avengers Assemble moment. In the Philippines, really, and guess what? Your elections are coming up too. So, ain't so far away for you. Here, I've said this over and over, that really, this is... When this happened, 140,000 people died instantly in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The same thing has happened in our information ecosystem, but it is silent and it is insidious. This is what I said in the Nobel lecture. An atom bomb has exploded in our information ecosystem. And here's the reason why, right? Very simple things. And I peg it to when journalists lost the gatekeeping powers. Atlantic. I wish we still had the gatekeeping powers, but we don't. And we probably lost it around 2014 to 2015. 2014 pivotal. 2015 was when instant articles rolled out. So that meant we brought news into the social media platforms voluntarily. We did this voluntarily. So what happened? Content creation, and I hate it when journalists are called content creators because we're much more than that. I think the key part of journalism is courage. But content creation was separated from distribution. And then the distribution had completely new rules that no one knew about. We experienced it in motion. And by 2018, MIT writes a paper that says that lies laced with anger and hate spread faster and further than facts. This is my 36th year as a journalist. I've spent that entire time learning how to tell stories that will make you care. But when we're up against lies, we just can't win because facts are really boring. Hard to capture your amygdala the way lies do. So this is baked into that, right? So think about it like this, right? All of our debate starts with content moderation. This is on the tech platforms. That's downstream. Move further upstream to algorithmic amplification. That's the operating system that determines, that's where the micro-targeting, what is algorithm, opinion in code. That's where like one editor's decision is multiplied millions and millions of times. And that's not even where the problem is. You go further upstream to here, which is where our personal data has been pulled together by machine learning for a model of you that knows you better than you know yourself. And then all of that is pulled together by artificial intelligence, and that's the mother lode, right? That means that surveillance capitalism, Shoshana Zuboff's business model, right? That is what powers this entire thing, and we only debate content moderation. That's like, if it's a polluted river, you're only looking at the test tube of water versus where the pollutant is coming from. I call it a virus of lies. But that's important because today we live in a behavior modification system. The platforms, the tech platforms that now distribute the news are actually biased against facts, and they're biased against journalists, right? E.O. Wilson, he passed away in December, but he studies emergent behavior in ants. So think about emergent behavior in humans, right? He said the greatest crisis we face is our Paleolithic emotions, our medieval institutions, and our godlike technology. Now think of emergent human behavior. What travels faster and further? Hate, anger, conspiracy theories, right? And then do you wonder why we have no shared space? I say this over and over. Without facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without these, we have no shared space. And democracy is a dream. Oh, sorry, one last back. Not again, don't. One more time. Surveillance capitalism, our private experiences, pulls together all of these four things. And we look at them as separate problems, but they're identical, right? That is antitrust. There are 3 antitrust bills that are pending at the US Senate. Data privacy. Who owns your data? Do you, or does the company that collates them and creates a model of you? User safety. Do we have a better business bureau for our brains? And the 4th, content moderation, which is, as long as you're thinking content, you're not looking at everything else. All right, so I'm going to kind of show you how we discovered it. So this is a little granular, and I'm going to go through this fast because you can plug in your own version of what you've discovered. This is how we discovered it in the Philippines, and it was in September 2016 when a bomb exploded in Davao City, the home city of President Duterte. And what was interesting is that was the headline, but yet a 6-month-old article, so this is disinformation, right? You take a truth, twist it. 6-month-old man with a bomb found at a checkpoint. And it was seeded in websites, fake websites. If I click that website today, it's a Chinese website. And it was seeded on Facebook pages, Duterte and Marcos pages. And so this is the story that we did in 2016, Propaganda War, Weaponizing the Internet. It was part of a 3-part series. The second part was this. It looks like a lot of data. It's only an Excel sheet, but it's one account, Lu Vimin Kancho. And we looked at this account and found it strange that she didn't have many friends, but was members of many, many, many groups. And then we took the photo and did a reverse imaging scan. Korean pop star, not this person. And then we took a look at who was following, who was she following, who were her friends. This is 2016, so you could still get that. So this is the Excel sheet that we did. And then each one of us took one vertical column and tried to prove whether it was actually true, where they went to school, where they lived. Every single thing there is a lie. This is a sock puppet network, right? And so my co-founder did this, fake accounts, manufactured reality on social media. The last part of the trilogy, and again, think this is 2016, was I wrote this last part, which is how Facebook algorithms impact democracy. It didn't get better, it got worse. So what did we do? In order to do that, once you realize it's systematic, that it is taking a lie and pounding, that it is using free speech to stifle free speech, right? Because when you are pounded to silence, you kind of shut up, unless you're foolish like me, you know? So what we did is we took all the data, and here's the data of something that we gave our social media team. We were alpha partners of Facebook, and we're still partners. Rappler is one of 2 Filipino fact-checking partners of Facebook until today. I'd say we're frenemies. But you know, I think tech is part of the solution. So look, this is what happened in 2016 when we rolled out that 3-part series. All the way to the left is the website. So you can see they work together, right? And then in the middle is the Facebook page that shares the website. And then it turns red when it's shared more than 10 times. This is what happened after we published that internet weaponization of the internet series. So it was 2016 October, and it turned red. And you can see, I'm gonna bring you into the Facebook page of Sally Matay. This has now been taken down, but you can see the methodology, right? It's a cut and paste account. This one is just the growth part, where we were still catching their growth. You gotta look, the data's pretty incredible. Right? So everything I tell you is data-driven. And you can also see we kept track of how many times they were posting in which Facebook pages. This is the first time we saw Marcos and Duterte disinformation networks working together. I'm gonna bring it back to you, because the methodology is the same. This is a map from the Election Integrity Partnership of Stop the Steal. And this is the same methodology used to attack me. In Stop the Steal, you can see that the narrative of election fraud was seeded in August 2019 on RT, then picked up by Steve Bannon on YouTube, seeded in Closed Pages. Then Tucker Carlson picks it up, and then QAnon drops it October 7th, and President Trump comes top down. What happened to me in 2016? A lie told 1,000,000 times became a fact. My meta-narrative, journalist equals criminal. And then a year later, President Duterte came top down with the same meta-narrative, except he did it in his State of the Nation address, you know. And then a week later, I got my first subpoena. That year, we had 14 investigations. In less than 2 years, by 2019, I got 10 arrest warrants, posted bail 10 times. So, same methodology. See how it is happening to you. And what happened to me in July? In the middle of the pandemic, I was the first case. My former colleague and I, this is cyber libel, for a story that was published 8 years earlier when the period of libel was only, period of prescription is 1 year, right? Lo and behold, it became 12 years. But I was convicted, and so I'm appealing this at the Court of Appeals. But this is the headline of the New York Times. It says, conviction in the Philippines reveals Facebook's, I can't remember the last one, but harms, I think. These are real world harms, right? So this is happening to women and women journalists. If you remember, one of the things that Mark Zuckerberg says is that, you know, the way, he quotes Brandeis all the time. The way you get at bad speech is to have more speech. In the old days, Brandeis wrote that in 1927. In the age of social media, when you have the age of abundance, we have to look back at Brandeis's words, and you'll see that in his, in what he wrote, he also said that, women are burned as witches. He referred to how women, how what we are seeing today, I mean, these words are what it reminded me, how gender disinformation hit women, journalists, politicians. It brings out the worst of us, because it's almost like, if you're my age, you remember the old cartoon when, you know, you have a conscience and you have a devil and an angel trying to tell you what to do on each shoulder. But what social media has done, what American tech has done, well, you gotta include TikTok now. But what it's done is, it's kicked off the angel, it's given the devil a megaphone, and it's injected directly into your brain. So this is a UNESCO report, The Chilling Global Trends in Online Violence. And what's interesting here is I was the example for the Global South. Carol Cadwallader, the British journalist who broke the Cambridge Analytica story, was the Global North. And you can see this is ICFJ, the International Center for Journalists, said that 75% of women journalists experienced online, 73% experienced online abuse, 25% received threats of physical violence, like death threats. I get a lot of those. 20% had been attacked or abused offline in connection. What happens in the virtual world happens in the real world, right? That thing where people think they're different, disabuse your mind of that. There is only one world, because we live in both worlds, right? This is what happened, the kinds of attacks that came against me. They looked at almost 500,000 social media attacks. There was a point in time when I was getting 90 hate messages per hour. And you can see what they meant to do. 60% was meant to tear down credibility. There's a reason why you don't believe news organizations anymore, because that is an information operation. And then the second part, 40%, were meant to tear down my spirit. It didn't work, but it's really painful. Now I'm gonna just wrap this up so Adrian could come up, right? So this is, after the Nobel, I come back home and then I realize, oh my gosh, I'm getting new attacks again. That's December, like here, at that spike of attacks, right? And so all I did was, I just went through and found out, okay, so where are the attacks coming from? This is Twitter. And you can see what we looked at were the creation dates of the Twitter accounts. They were all created around the time of elections. Did I mention 33 days before elections? It's like 1986 all over again. The Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is running against another widow, Leni Robredo. She's our vice president. So look at that big spike. Now, that is the pro-Marcos account. This is the gray are the pro-Leni accounts. So you can see something that would be looking more organic versus something that looks artificial, right? The red is artificial. We gave it to Twitter, and guess what they did? So, well, first we did a story before we gave it to Twitter. And then Twitter did this. It says suspends over 300 accounts in the Marcos network. There'll be more, which hopefully we will be seeing, because the gatekeeping, you know, if you're a gatekeeper, you cannot abdicate responsibility because you subject all of us to the harms. Here's the solution. And tech Journalism, community. Those are the three pillars of Rappler, even from the beginning, right? So you hear me, like, part of the reason I'm here is because I testified at the Senate Subcommittee on East Asian Affairs, and I asked for legislation. It's not where I started in 2016, because I thought they were like journalists, you know, self-regulation. They're not. So technology needs guardrails in place, and we can talk about that more. But the second thing is journalism needs to survive, right? Oh, the tech part. We built a platform, right? Spent a lot of money at it, and took much longer because so much of our money was going to legal fees. But it's rolling out in time for our elections. And then the second part is we got to help independent media survive. And that's part of the reason before the Nobel, I agreed to co-chair the International Fund for Public Interest Media that's asking governments in the democratic world, democratic governments, to actually put some money to help journalists survive. And then finally, the last is community. Now, I want to show you how they all come into effect, because we're in the last 33 days before elections. I call it the hashtag FactsFirstPH, and don't strain yourself. I'll tweet the actual thing. But what it is there is a tech platform going through the 4 layers of this pyramid. And we really started, this is kind of what I used the Nobel for. We started building this community January. And you know, what it is you realize that fact-checking, news organizations rarely share each other, have never really in the Philippines. And so what we did is 6 committed to fact-check the lies. We ask our communities, when you see a lie, send it to us on the same tip line, and then this is working with Midan and the Google News Initiative. We actually said, all right, we're gonna meta tag everything. It's gonna have the data, and then we're gonna be able to course it through the 4 layers of this pyramid. What are the 4 layers? So each of the news groups have links to each other. That's good for search. And they also then share each other. Use your power, right? And then beyond that, it moves to the second layer. I call it the mesh. Again, it's fun to make things up. Do you guys see that movie, Don't Look Up? Do you see that? You remember how the planetary defense system came together like a mesh? That's kind of the way we have to live right now on social media, because meaning has been commoditized, and each of us has to take our area of influence and clean it up. Then we connect it to each other like a mesh. So these are all our human rights organizations, our business groups, the church, environmental groups, civil societies, and NGO, who are taking what the news groups are doing and sharing it with emotion. Because we don't have emotions, we journalists. That's a joke. And then after mesh, you go up to research. This was actually inspired by your election integrity partnership in the US. So this is every week, a research group, one of the 7, will come out and tell Filipinos how we are being manipulated, who is gaining and who is behind the networks of disinformation. And finally, the last layer is the most important one, and they've been quiet for too long. Legal groups, right? If you don't have facts, you cannot have rule of law. So these legal groups now are working hand in hand with the pyramid. They get the data pipeline, and they then file both strategic and tactical litigation. I'll tell you how it goes in 33 days. But it's working because look at the cases. So I'm going to end soon, don't worry. These are my legal cases. I have 7. Those are the ones I have to ask for permission to travel. But just on April Fools, and it wasn't an April Fool's joke, 7 new legal complaints were thrown out. That's good. But we also have 16 more new ones, right? So this isn't ending. It's still a whack-a-mole game. But we will win it. The one that I think is important is look at the last one. This is from the Solicitor General, who really started the weaponization of the law. And he called the FactsFirstPH, he called fact-checking prior restraint. And on April 10th, so right before here, I was looking at our submission to the Supreme Court, because we had 10 days to file. We're going to win this. So that's where I'll pull it all together, right? I think what this world shows us is that we have a lot more in common than we have differences, believe it or not. As a journalist, I grew up looking at each country and every culture differently. But what the tech platforms actually showed us is the silver lining. we're all being manipulated the same way. You know, we have a lot more in common. So even things like identity politics, right? What happened in the US in 2016 when both sides of Black Lives Matter was pounded open. Be aware, think slow, not fast. Thank you. Hello.
That was so great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Adrienne LaFrance. I'm the Atlantic's executive editor, and I want to just start by saying thank you so much to the University of Chicago for hosting us. This is really exciting to be here, and thank you so much to all of you for joining us. And Maria, it's an honor to get to share the stage with you.
She was the grown-up. I should have said all those things too. Thank you. Thanks, Adrienne.
So we're going to have a brief conversation. I want to ask you some questions,
Sure.
and then we'll open it up to your questions too. So please be thinking about what you'd like to ask Maria. We'll have some mic runners for that in just a little bit. But I want to start, I want to go to some of the solutions just because that's such a key to how we move forward. But I want to start by going back a little bit and specifically to the start of Rappler.
Can I say?
Sure.
Okay, so when she was still with Nieman Lab, she was the first West American reporter to write about Rappler.
We go way back.
2013? 2012.
Something like that,
2012.
yeah.
Like, so this is how I know Adrienne. So I was really psyched she headed the
So
Watch her.
we go way back, right? And when we talked all those years ago, like 10 years ago, I remember you said something, because Rappler, for those who don't know it very well, and you should, of course, all go read it, its DNA is sort of part social network, part news organization, and it's always been that way. And so you're kind of fascinatingly, presciently predisposed for the situation you're now in, I would say. And I'm curious to hear about, something we talked about all those years ago was how, your preoccupation with emotional contagion. And I remember you saying something to me to the effect of, we need to create informational environments where people can be rational and not just emotional. That was 10 years ago. Here we are now. When you think back to sort of what your dreams were for Rappler when you started, what's your primary observation about what's changed other than it's gotten worse? And do you still feel like that's the core mission? Is it enough?
My God, there are three things that are there right off the top. So we came out with a mood meter and a mood navigator like a few years before Facebook did the emoji. But the reason for the mood meter was because I wanted to see how a story impacted our society emotionally, right? And it was actually used by several universities to look at sharing, how people share online, and it's based on valence, arousal, and dominance.
Well, and you had readers, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you had readers actually respond like, this article makes me angry, or
Right.
and
Correct.
anger was
Correct.
one of them, as I recall.
Correct. No, but at that point in time, until 2016, the top emotion was happy in the Philippines, right? So we really looked at this stuff, and we knew when people were angry because it wasn't being gamed and we weren't manipulating. So the question that you had is social contagion. Like, I thought that if you click how you feel, that would stop you and make you think, and because you stop to think, you become more rational. This is what our conversation was like. And part of the reason was because, and again, we go back evil to good to evil. That's kind of, I began looking at social network theory when I was looking at how the virulent ideology of terrorism spreads, right? So how did Al-Qaeda's, how did they convince people in Southeast Asia, and the Al-Qaeda's arm was called the Jamaat Islamiyah, to actually blow themselves up? Right? How do you do that? And so when I was looking at that, and I looked at how to create social cascades, we looked at emotions. We all know emotions are important. I was hoping, again, against hope, that we could use it for good. And we still do, because we don't manipulate you with the algorithms. We don't micro-target you. We don't collect the kind of data that you now give freely we all give freely. I mean, that's our devil's Faustian bargain. We're on the losing end, right? So we're to fast forward to today. I haven't given up, but this is why I believe that we need to get legislation in place that our data should be ours, that Section 230 should be killed, because in the end, these platforms, your technology platforms, are not like the telephone. They decide, they weigh in on what you get. And the primary driver is money. It's surveillance capitalism. So the micro-targeting, it's like going to a psychologist, I'm gonna quote Tristan Harris, going to a psychologist and telling the psychologist your deepest, darkest secret, and then that psychologist goes around and says, yo, who wants this? Who's the highest bidder? I got Adrian's secret. That's kind of what we're doing, you know, so, It's a bleak moment, Adria. Let's put it that way. Like, let's see what happens in our elections, because Facts First PH is working. Otherwise, why do we have a whole new spate of cases or complaints? They're just legal complaints now. But I'll give you an idea for what that means. And I know I can say this. I know we have a live stream. But what that means is for a person running a news group, that I have to worry about the people named on that complaint, that they could be picked up on the last day of right before Easter vacation. So that would be like Holy Thursday in the Philippines. Everything shuts down for Easter. And when that happens, if they're arrested, they will stay in jail until the Monday after, right? So these are the kinds of harassment we have to deal with. It makes me very angry.
As it should. Can we talk a little bit about, a little bit more on that? And I want to go back to the sort of architecture of the social web as it should be and what we need to do. But in terms of, I'm really curious to hear you talk about, press freedom in the Philippines has not been robust historically, and yet it seems to have gotten particularly bad in recent years. Certainly you've experienced this firsthand. Can you talk about, especially for an audience of many Americans, what it is like to experience that slide, and especially the things that people may not notice are changing around them as the ground sort of shifts underneath them?
I talked about, so first press freedom, in 1986, so 36 years ago, a people power revolt ousted Ferdinand Marcos and his whole family. So look, I'm gonna go back to history. Ferdinand Marcos declared victory in the 1986 elections, and in 4 days, the people came out on the streets, and by the 4th or 5th day, the US helicopters took the family out of the Philippines, right? That's the people power revolt, helped global movements, and we all thought democracy was here to stay. How wrong we were. 36 years later, our elections are emblematic, because part of the reason that Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is winning is in the statistical
and
survey.
quite popular.
Winning, yes, maybe no. How do you look at the impact of disinformation, right? When and we've exposed this starting in 2014. That was when these networks began. When you pound it, you can change history in front of your eyes. That's what happened to us. And if he wins, partly that will be because of this, right? So emblematic of the battle for facts. That's why the battle for facts is critically important. If we lose this, I don't think it's ours alone. Look, in 1986, people power brought freedom of the press, and our governments, no president has really ever liked me completely in the Philippines. That's okay.
That's a good thing as a journalist.
Right, I don't mind, right? So long as they respect you or they think you're fair, which is all we're after. But today it's so much different. And I think it's not even that they want to, it's not about you. They don't need you. They'll create their own, right? So they're like Alex Jones in the States. We now have a group in the Philippines. This is the one, the preacher of President Duterte. His name is Apollo Quiboloy. He's wanted by the FBI for sex trafficking. But he has one of the largest Facebook pages for disinformation. And he just received a television franchise from the government in a midnight deal. So what they do is, instead of actually dealing with a journalist, they just create their own. If people can't tell fact from fiction, it's going to be who you like. You don't like the way I look, you like Adrian better. It's that simple, right? Or she makes you feel better, or she makes you feel angrier, then you listen to that. How do we protect the facts, right? So look, it happened to you. And it's happening to you. And Americans tend to think that, that you're immune because you're smart.
Well, so what do you think Americans, whether journalists or just individuals, institutions, what should people be doing now or yesterday or 5 years ago to prevent what's happened in the Philippines, or to prevent the beginnings of what we've already seen here in terms of freedom of expression, press freedom, slide into authoritarianism, all of it?
The manipulation isn't about how smart or how not smart you are. The manipulation is our biology. It's your biology. It's the manipulation of your emotions. So the minute you get angry, right, don't share yet. I mean, I talked about valence, arousal, and dominance, right? So I'll take this first in the virtual world, and then I'll go into democratic in the physical world. Valence is how content makes you feel. Arousal is the kind of emotion you feel. So anger is high arousal. Sadness is low arousal. You're more prone to share high arousal versus low arousal. And dominance is how empowered you feel in the moment. So what people share the most, so for example, if people are afraid, like we were in the Philippines for long periods of time, you don't share, because low dominance. Now take that into the real world. What's happening in the virtual world is exactly how we're supposed to vote. You're still lucky. You don't feel fear for your safety yet, but democracy is so fragile. And all of it rests on what we believe, on the facts, on that shared reality. So I guess we're the guinea pigs for you, right? So this is what Cambridge Analytica, the whistleblower Christopher Wiley, said about the Philippines. He called us the petri dish. And he said that Cambridge Analytica and the parent company, SCL, I think you wrote about this, tested these tactics of manipulation, of mass manipulation in countries like the Philippines, Kenya, Nigeria, the global south, because you can get away with it. And then if they worked in our countries, the word he used is they ported it over to you. It works in ours, it works in yours.
Let's talk about the platforms for a minute. I know you mentioned TikTok earlier, which I also want to hear your views on, but I'll ask a sort of oversimplified question just to get your reaction. If you had like a magic wand and could make one of the platforms go away, I don't know, Google, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, obviously some of those entities own one another, but which concerns you most, and which one's absence would make us, humanity, better off?
I think we have to do the same with all of them, which is, they cannot insidiously manipulate us. If you've heard me talk, I talk about genetic research, for example, right? And CRISPR technology. Our technology is much smarter than our technology is manipulating. Like CRISPR technology can basically customize your baby. But in our countries, in your country, you cannot do that. You put guardrails because we don't have the wisdom of gods. But we don't do that in our minds. Right? So all the platforms, but I'll say this, right? Because I'll answer your question directly. And I'll put it in the Philippines. You tell me in the US, right?
It's a hard one. I'll tell you.
Okay, so in the Philippines, Facebook is the world's largest delivery platform of news. And for the 6th year in a row last year, Filipinos spent the most time online and on social media globally. That's why we're like your Drosophila fruit flies. We're the guinea pigs. But the other part is because 100% of Filipinos on the internet, 100% are on Facebook. YouTube, as early as 2013, Filipinos uploaded and downloaded the most number of videos on YouTube globally. And then here's the other part, right? So if disinformation, like the historical denialism of the Marcos disinformation networks, they would start on YouTube. When they are shared on Facebook, Facebook doesn't actually check that because the content isn't on Facebook. Right? So here it is. It's an entire ecosystem of manipulation. I do not understand why we allow that. It's not me. I'm just the victim. Please do something about it. It's you. You got more power than I do. So Adrienne, here in the United States.
I mean, my short answer would be Facebook and Google have been most consequential for news organizations and the informational environment in that way. But I think I really worry about YouTube. I think it's a sort of under scrutinized, and Google for that matter too. I think the extent to which we've just totally outsourced our relationship with knowledge to Google is frightening. So all of them, maybe TikTok is also, I mean,
And that's the
so
newest
new.
black box, right, where
Right.
everyone has gone in. And I think our other problem with this is that we news people, I'm looking at them, we actually voluntarily gave away our deepest relationships when we put a share button on our websites.
Rappo doesn't have that, does it?
We
you?
do,
Would
because
you get
we
rid
were
of it?
born on Facebook, right? I drank the Kool-Aid. And that's also,
Everybody did. I mean, the whole industry did.
exactly. So here's the other part that's for news people, right? Right now, we are letting the technology platforms determine what news survives. And we already know what the algorithms amplify. So what news will survive?
So relatedly, how should we change? I know you mentioned Section 230, and we could get into that or not. It's wonky quickly. But how should we change the sort of architecture of the social web to both allow for dissent, which, by the way, is also very important for democracy, and not, hopefully avoid tech companies making all of the big decisions on our behalves, but also hopefully prevent harm and abuse?
It's not a free speech issue. This is not a free speech issue. Like, don't believe the lie. This is actually that algorithm and the data. This is tech and data. That's what we need to look at. Because, look, I can turn to my neighbor and tell a lie, right? You can tell your neighbor a lie, but it won't get amplified to 10 million people, right? It's the distribution that's the problem. So, to quote a comedian, it's a freedom of reach issue, not a freedom of speech issue. Sacha Baron Cohen said this. He had more wisdom than we did. I'm just saying, right? So freedom of speech has never been the problem. It's just a good way to have you looking at that. Because if we're creating Supreme Courts for content, how slowly does the Supreme Court for content work? And how quickly does the virality of lies spread? That's the gap. Right? Did I mention I'm part of the real Facebook oversight?
Well, and I was going to say, and who's in charge of making those decisions is another huge question. You should talk for a minute about what the real oversight board is and the other oversight board.
The real Facebook oversight board was really when your elections were coming up, we were alarmed. And these are people like Shoshana Zuboff, Carol Cadwalader, who broke the Cambridge Analytica story. Shoshana Zuboff is my new, I won't say other things that may be politically incorrect. I was going to say, that model of, it's 750 pages, her book. If you haven't read it, you should, because I think the repercussions are huge for us, but it is power and money, and that is part of what's wrong. So we need to fix this, right? What is the source of the inordinate corporate gain that these companies have had? It's all of our data. It's our personal lives. So if you think about what our internet should look like, it's not that hard to imagine it. The laws in the real world, which have checks and balances, which protect both individual rights and the public sphere, those need to be reflected in the virtual world.
Say a little more specifically what you mean. So I'll give you an example. Some people would argue, I think Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, has said, for instance, that to the point about freedom of reach, as you put it, that we should have circuit breakers, basically, for when something's about to go extremely viral, so there's sort of a check before it does. Obviously, I for a long time argued for better content moderation, which is a very journalistic way of looking at things. I've since come to the view that that's not going to be what solves our problems. But speak a little bit more specifically about when you talk about protecting individuals and communities, and also doing that, hopefully, I'm coming at it from a very American perspective as well, in terms of free speech, not just from government oppression, but culturally. And I think people do have this expectation that you should be able to go out, if these are the new public squares, and debate one another, and not have anyone tell you what you can or can't say. So get into what does that look like in practice?
But again, I'll go back to you can't debate anymore on these social media platforms, right? Because in the age of abundance, and because the business model helps it to go this way, because they want you to stay on the site longest, the emotion that's encouraged is moral outrage, and moral outrage becomes mob rule. Right? So is it a surprise, for example, that you have genocide in Myanmar? in Myanmar, both the UN and Facebook sent people there, and they know the role they played. And yet, like with 2016 and the IRA and the GRU in the US presidential elections, impunity continues. So this is, part of it is I want rule of law. Okay, now your question is, free speech. It isn't a free speech issue. It is, again, what you amplify. Imagine if The Atlantic decided, I'm going to make money at all costs, and I'm going to amplify the most, the content that will make the most people angry because they will stay on my site the longest and they will share it the most. We don't do that because we have standards and ethics, right? You're laughing. That's my point. So it goes back. One of the things I really tried to distill is, what are the values that are there? And then, so here's a last thing that, I was talking about this with a friend. Corporate shareholder value above all costs. We have some platforms saying that, it's about the corporate shareholder. We're here to make money for them, so it's your problem. That's amoral. News people tend to actually, have standards and ethics. And you know what? We can be good business people also. We just won't take advantage of you. But anyway, so here's the problem. What happens where is the line where amoral becomes evil? Because we are back at the time of World War II. I mean, the last time.
Have we crossed that line?
I believe so.
When? Was it back in 2014 when instant articles came out, or more recent? Or before then?
I was with CNN when we grew from chicken noodle news to the world's breaking news leader. So I know how difficult and overwhelming it can be to revamp while the bus is going to change the tires, right? So I gave a lot of leeway. But now what we're seeing is the platforms are doubling down, some of them, and they're actually saying, it's up to you. But every day that there isn't a law, that there aren't guardrails in place, someone dies. Where's the line to evil? When you know people die because you're making more money and you continue doing it. So, yeah, I'm very angry. I try not to be angry. Wait, optimism. There is optimism,
okay.
Right? So the hope, where will the hope come from? Ukraine, okay? This is horrific, right? What we're seeing happening in Ukraine and what Russia has done. But how quickly did the free world come together, right? And all of a sudden, the world seems to be righting itself. But the platforms haven't really changed yet. And what sparked the change online? It wasn't a government, it was Zelensky.
I was going to say, I also feel that we're at the very beginning of understanding the platform's role in this. Like, we still don't have it's, all fog of war, et cetera, but we have a very limited sense of the information flow still.
I'm already in it's bad, really. I mean, I really feel the algorithm. So part of it is, it's not feel, I can share the data. I'll tweet a few things after this. But, so in this one, I guess what I'm saying, so look, here's what's happening in the Philippines and with Zelensky. In the Philippines, Leni Robredo, who is our vice president, was sidelined during the last 6 years of the Duterte administration. I interviewed her right before I left for the United States, and she said there have been record crowds coming to her campaign rallies. And she said, Maria, it's so passionate. People don't go door to door in the Philippines, but people were going. And hundreds of thousands of people coming to her to her rallies. And she said, why didn't they do this sooner? But the reality is that she didn't declare sooner. There was no leader with those values, right? So it's a chicken or the egg. And I understood her anger. She explained it more in the interview where she said that she was alone. She felt very alone. We felt alone. And when you feel alone, you kind of you hunker down, but you get both angry and afraid. So now here we are. She's sparking something. Is it enough time? And that's simultaneous to watching what Zelensky was doing in Ukraine, right? If he had left one person, wouldn't the Russians have marched in?
And to be fair, he and others are using platforms to promote democracy, which is what sort of the utopian dream for the internet was.
But they are doing that as real people. That's the idea behind Facts First, right? It's not the design of the platforms. Again, I go back, the design of the platforms. This is by design a behavior modification system that sells us our weakest moments for profit. So this is a problematic thing. When it used to be advertisers, maybe we could survive. But
let me ask one more
not
question.
countries,
I want to
right?
make sure we're giving a chance to the audience to ask
Okay,
questions.
sorry,
My
I'll
last
shut
question.
up.
No. Before we go there, though, I want to ask what you think of Elon Musk being on the Twitter board.
I should turn this around on you, Adrian.
No, you shouldn't.
I don't know. It's kind of like where we are right now, right? We know his track record, and that can be worrying, but it's a shift. And so far, and I'll tell you, in the Philippines, that data pipeline in our 4-tiered pyramid, some of it goes directly to the platforms, and Twitter is one of the platforms that immediately said yes. And you can see that they are proactive in dealing with disinformation. Will that change? I'll tell you what the data shows, but right now it's too soon to tell, so I'll give them the benefit of the doubt.
Fair. Who has questions? Please just, if you raise your hand, I'll try to direct. We have some over here, please, and I'll try to make sure we get to people across the room.
I need to stand up. Should I stand up? Please, I'll stand up. Hi. Thank you so much for being here and for that very, very interesting conversation. I'm Cyrena Johnson-Roulier. I'm a professor at the University of Notre Dame, and I'm very interested in these issues, and I'm going to speak to something that you said regarding the fact that we do not yet feel safe. That we feel safe, and we're not worried about our safety. And I immediately thought, when you said that is only if you're not black or brown in this country. And so that led me to think about the fact that there is an enormous division between races in this country, and that division leads directly to voting and voting legislation, because if Black Americans do not vote, then there's less possibility that Democrats will win. And so from there, I want to say that I'm also a journalist, and I'm scared, because what I'm doing is I'm writing from a position that is completely taboo in our country, because I grew up in a small town whose ideology is a cross between the Transcendentalists and the utopian movement from the 19th century. What that means is that I'm black, but I didn't grow up black.
And I don't mean to cut you off. Is there a question?
Yes, there is a question. The question is, how would you approach these kinds of issues when right now it's about audience? And audiences choose what they want to see and what they want to think about. And so I'm just wondering how you would approach the complexity of this.
When you say audiences choose, that's a fundamental difference with me. I don't think you choose. You know, this black box of algorithmic amplification chooses for you. Yes, you may click on one or two things, but the overall micro-targeting that gets you the content that you think you chose is chosen by the platforms for surveillance capitalism. That's one. The problems in the real world are still there. They've just been made significantly worse by the virtual world, by the tech platforms. Because again, look at the IRA and the GRU, right? These were always vulnerable fault lines of society. And a leader tries to heal the fault lines. But if you want to get to the core of our societies, you pound them open, right? And when you have a leader who uses us against them, it is amplified. So I've seen this in my country. I think the other thing I'll mention is that it's in some ways you actually said it. You think identity politics is also really used against you to make all of us far more, what's the right word? To set us against each other, right? I remember I said we all have much more in common than we have differences. I sound like a Pollyanna, but I've been a journalist for 36 years. That comes out of the experiences. We are being manipulated. Last thing I'll say on this, right? In Indonesia, and I'll take you to the world's largest Muslim population. In Indonesia, there were periods of times where they could not talk about race or ethnicity, or this was under the time of Suharto, right? Sara is what it's called in Indonesia. And so it was like they stifled all of this. And after Suharto, after almost 32 years of Suharto, this was lifted and it all came flying out. And I remembered in 1998 to 1999, going from city to city in 27 provinces where one group was literally trying to kill another. That's what happens when you suppress. But here's the other thing that also happened. When one group tries to use this against another, you also have open warfare. And what we're seeing globally is that these types of identity conflicts, fracture lines in society are being pushed open. So again, I can only say, in Indonesia during the time of the religious violence between Muslims and Christians in Ambon. Ambon is 50-50 Christian. A grenade that was thrown in sparked the killing of almost 10,000 people thrown into a mosque. So who really did it? You don't know, right? But the point is that's what's happening in our minds. Sorry, that's not to downplay. I'm brown. I grew up in America. I grew up in Toms River, New Jersey, right? If we're fighting over here, then the real problem festers and we just get significantly worse.
Want to go to other questions, maybe over here? And if you could just please keep your questions short, then we'll have more time for more of them. I think right down the middle, sorry.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you very much for speaking with us. My name is Amina. I'm a student at the college from Egypt. And something you said about using free speech to stifle free speech really stuck with me. But I wanted to ask about what you do when disinformation, algorithms, the structure of the social web as a whole has silenced free speech to the extent that individuals, they no longer have the encouragement or need to not only engage with the politics that they're surrounded by, but have become silenced in their thoughts. And I'm not talking about everybody having the ability to engage in free speech. I'm talking about silencing when it's coming from the people that are in control, from the people that are in politics, a top-down structure where the algorithms are the politicians' tools. And so I wanted to know what kind of social reform or legislation that you think is able to regain that trust in those people. Thank you.
Thank you. So again, the methodology is we pump it, it's bottom up, the lies, and then comes top down from power, and that's part of, what we have to deal with. In Washington, D.C., earlier this week, one of the things I kept saying is, let's stop thinking about Web 2.0. We are in a place where human rights activists, women, LGBTQ+, I said this in the Nobel lecture, those who are marginalized are further marginalized, right? You have Madeleine Albright, who actually, NDI had I think they celebrated this is going to be their 6th year of trying to encourage women politicians in the United States and all around the world to stay in politics because it has become so toxic for women. Women journalists, a lot of American women journalists keep this stuff to themselves, because sometimes, hopefully not in the Atlantic, because you don't. But I mean, I've sat with women correspondents, strong women correspondents, who get these attacks and then they push it away. But the attack shouldn't have happened in the first place, right? So what do we do with that? Guardrails. So what are the laws? The reason why I think in the short term, the Section 230, which is probably not going to happen in the short term, but it was the only thing I could think of that would have any impact right now. Because the minute the platforms are responsible for what they amplify for that content, they will take it down. They're very good about taking down terrorist content now. They're very good about IP, right? When it comes to money, they're very good at that. They can use the same things for this. That's one. Short term. Medium term is going to be, you have data privacy laws. National Privacy Commission has been pushing for this in the United States. You have 3 antitrust bills, David Sisselin, and you know, that huge report that came out, where is it, right? Lina Khan is pushing forward on some of this stuff. But here's where I saw the hope. March 26, the Market Services Act passed. The Democracy Action Plan of the EU finally moved out of content and is moving to the algorithms and must go to the black box of our data, right? But there are 2 parts of it, the Market Services Act and the Digital Services Act.
Well, in the US, we have such a long way to go, unfortunately.
You can't. You got to get moving on this, right?
I could stay and talk forever with Maria about this. I'm sorry we didn't have more time for questions. Before we go, I just want to say thank you so much. And in particular, thank you for continuing to fight for press freedom. It is so important and means so much to me personally and to all of our colleagues. So thank you for being here. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thanks for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Anne Applebaum, staff writer for The Atlantic, and David Axelrod, founding director of the Institute of Politics.
Thank you. Wow. I feel like a slice of lunch meat on a Nobel Prize sandwich here. And thank God that I have Anne Applebaum with me.
We're the sorbet course, you know, in between
nice.
in between the important dishes. You
know. Well played. Like I said, I'm glad I have you with me. But for those who don't know, and I think many of you do, Anne is one of the most incisive writers on global politics, particularly the politics of, but not limited to, Eastern Europe, and has become, over the years, a important voice on this issue. I've been reading all your wonderful pieces lately, scary exhortations at times about where we are right now. You live in Poland, right across the border from Ukraine, and we'll get to that. But you just wrote a piece called Why We Should Read Hannah Arendt Now. And I raise that not just because she taught here and we're very parochial, but because you wrote your first line of that very good piece was, so much of what we imagine to be new is old. So many of the seemingly novel illnesses that afflict modern society are really just resurgent cancers diagnosed and described long ago. We heard Maria speak about what is part of what is new, but I'd love you to sort out in the struggle between autocracy and democracy, what is old and what is new?
So first of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Not actually the first time I've spoken at an Institute of Politics event, and so glad to be back, I should say. I mean, when the founders of the United States of America were writing our Constitution, one of the things that they were worried about was demagogues who might come to power by abusing the trust of the mob. And so that was, more than 2 centuries ago. And when they were having that conversation and having those discussions, most of what they were reading was about the Roman Republic, which was a subject of widespread knowledge and curiosity in colonial America, including the subject of some popular plays and poetry. So what we're talking about when we speak about autocrats and the appeal of autocrats is extremely old. I mean, it is maybe the oldest political idea in humanity.
It was addressed in Federalist One, actually.
Federalist One, and Alexander Hamilton was reading about Caesar, Julius Caesar. So many of these questions have been discussed and discussed over and over again. And it's important, I think, also to keep remembering that, because some of what is new is, in fact, the technology's ability to draw out and amplify some of those human emotions and desires. So what seems to me to be new is the ability, is the way that we communicate and the ways in which that communication now amplify, create and play into and use the desire for autocracy, or create it, or the fear and anger that that lead people to demand autocracy. So nothing is new about the emotions. What is new is the ability of internet platforms to evoke them and amplify them.
What about the deployment of these technologies by autocrats, not just in their own countries, but as an offensive weapon? That seems, I mean, we've always had those efforts, but they've sort of been turbocharged now.
Yeah, so it's very interesting to look at in the 1980s, when the Soviet Union wanted to create a piece of disinformation, a conspiracy theory. And this is a true story. They wanted to create the theory that...
How do we know it's true?
So,
anyway,
the story of how they did it is true, but they wanted to seed the conspiracy theory that the CIA had created AIDS, the AIDS epidemic. And they did it in a very specific way. They put an article appeared, I believe, in an Indian newspaper through a sort of friendly journalist speculating that this might be true. Then later another one in an Italian newspaper. Then they found another couple of papers that would print it, and sometimes those papers would then quote one another. At one point, they found an East German scientist who appeared in public and said he'd found some evidence that this was true. And they built up a case for the idea that the CIA had created AIDS over several years. Now, all of that, they can do exactly the same thing, except that it takes 10 minutes. Maria just described it. You can have a network of fake or even semi-fake websites. You can, that will take articles that have been, seeded or prepared in advance. They will then echo each other. People will then see, oh, look, there's several sources saying this, repeating the story over and over again. You can then create a botnet of trolls or even real people who you've organized to spread the story, and you can then move the story around the internet in 10 minutes, and you can give the impression that there's a wave of conversation and discussion about something, even though it doesn't exist and it's not true. So what's different is the scale and the speed.
Maria was discussing how this has been applied in the elections in the Philippines, but we experienced it with Russia and others, but Russia primarily interfering in our election. How new is that?
So this is a really, I mean, in a way, this is the dark side or the flip side of globalization, namely that we all now live in the same information market. So as I said, whereas in the past the Russians or the Soviet Union would have had to try and get something going in the Indian market and then the Italian market and then somehow seed that into the American market, it's now essentially one market. And so the ease with which they can first of all study American politics and understand it in a way that wasn't possible before, because they can use the same micro-targeting and research tools that marketers use. They can use that, and they can tailor messages to different groups in specific ways, again, in the same way that marketers use. I mean, the people who are selling soap powder or washing machines, they also have ways of targeting particular audiences, changing the message, whether you're in, Illinois or Florida or Wyoming, or whether you're rich or poor. And all that the Russians did was that they took those tools and they used them to target Black Lives Matter activists in one part of the country and anti-immigration activists in another part of the country. And of course, it's important to understand that what they did was no different from what American political campaigns do, very similar, in fact. And so the tools were available, and Whereas those kinds of tools in the past wouldn't have been available to outsiders or foreigners. Now they are, because everything's available. They can reach into our markets and send whatever messages they want. We have never, this is maybe to discuss later, we've never tried the same in reverse. I mean, not exactly the same thing, but we know very little about the Russian internet, for example. I don't think we spend a lot of time thinking about which groups in Russia would be interested in hearing our messages or thought of the kind of language we could use to send them. But they spent many years actually studying us, and the 2016 was the result of a long process.
Maria showed us a nuclear explosion, twice actually. That's the thing about nuclear weapons. Once you use them, it's hard to control them. But this is a pretty cheap and efficient way to really throw sort of a Stuxnet worm into the workings of democracies. I mean, Putin's army may be being proved deficient right now, but they have a pretty efficient cyber army of a much smaller nature that doesn't cost much to create a lot of havoc.
So one of the oddities of the current war, and one of the reasons why many people didn't believe it would take place, despite the intelligence that the U.S. had gathered and was sharing with European colleagues, was that up until now, the Russians had always been very cautious. Their tactic was to dismantle the enemy before you have to fight with the enemy. In other words, they seemed to want to avoid direct military conflict with the West because they believed they could sort of disarm and undermine the West in other ways. And they did it through many ways. I mean, it wasn't just through the use of the internet and Facebook. It was also through the funding of political parties in really almost every European country and many democracies around the world. It was through the use of bribery, but also just business contacts. They sought to create influence operations inside specific countries using mainstream business people and mainstream journalists. I had a conversation with an Italian journalist a couple of days ago who wanted to talk about, the Italian far right and Russian influence. I said, why don't you talk about the Italian business community, the mainstream business community, because they were just as important in shaping Italian views of, we must be pragmatic, we must deal with Russia, and so on. And the same is true in Germany. So they had multiple ways of looking to influence conversation. And so it's important to remember that their ultimate goal wasn't just to, win a popularity contest or a propaganda war. Their ultimate goal was to dismantle the European Union, to undermine NATO, to persuade the United States to leave Europe. I mean, they had very clear strategic goals, and the information piece of it wasn't PR, it was a part of those goals. It was an attempt to achieve them without actually fighting.
Yes, and in fact, it wasn't to promote their own image, it was to destroy out.
No, this is the big difference between modern Russian propaganda and Soviet propaganda. So there was no attempt to sell Russia, or very little, sometimes they did it, but no attempt to sell Russia as an ideal society. There was no communist paradise that was being offered. Their goal instead was to undermine us and to convince, first of all, to convince Russians that Europe is degenerate, that America is falling apart, and that there is nothing to admire or to seek in democracy, because Putin's main goal was to prevent Russians from wanting democracy, because he perceived his main political challenge as coming from the democracy movement and democracy activism in Russia, that once or twice during his rule has seemed to have a lot of power and force. And so, first of all, convincing Russia that democracy is nothing, it's all cynical, it's all fake, it's not true. And then secondly, seeking to reach people inside democracies and convincing them of the same. And of course, because we have those strains of our own, because our own societies are full of people who are angry or cynical or disappointed with the nature of modern America or modern Europe, he found, it's not as if he invented Marine Le Pen, the opposition leader in France, or he didn't invent Donald Trump. He simply found them and they were useful vectors. And so he sought to amplify them. So in that sense, that was it was an amplification project rather than creating something from scratch.
Nor did he create the fissures that were there, he mined them, he took advantage of them.
He did it, and then I think many others copied him. I mean, I do think that Russian actions in 2016 were important, partly because they paved the way, they showed others how it could be done, and also because of the use of leaked material from the DNC. That was a tactic that I'd seen used before. So when you leak secret information, even if the information is completely anodyne, which most of that was, I think all of it was, in fact, the public is attracted to the idea that something secret has been revealed. So something's been made public that was secret, and then you could use that to create conspiracy theories and hysteria. And I saw that done in Poland earlier on. I saw it done in other countries as well.
Well, and you saw it done to you.
I did see it, yes.
After your critical reporting on the Crimea, the invasion of Crimea and so on, all of a sudden you became the object of attention.
Yes, no. So there was a brief and very strange moment when a very odd journalist was in fact probably a former KGB agent in the United States began writing slanderous things about me. And this is actually how I learned about how this works, because one is always more interested in the slanderous things written about oneself. I mean, Maria knows this.
That does train the mind.
It sort of catches your attention,
yes.
And then you start following it around the internet. Where is it coming from? And this is exactly what she just described. You see it. Oh, look, it's on Ron Paul's website. Who knew the libertarians were interested in me? And then it appears in another place, and you begin to see how they echo one another. And in my case, the sort of height of it, and this is in about 2015, was when Julian Assange's Twitter account tweeted something about me being a paid agent of, I can't remember whether it was the Polish government or the CIA, but something like that. And so, why is Julian Assange tweeting that about me?
To his 4 million followers.
To his 4 million followers, yes.
Yeah. So obviously, 2016 was 2016, but you became, and that was part of it, you became very interested in this early on. And in fact, you and a colleague started a think tank. Yes, I became interested in this in 2013, and especially 2014, because we're all so proud of ourselves now that we're resisting Russian propaganda at the moment and the Russian description of the war in Ukraine. But actually, in 2014, Russian propaganda was quite successful, both the cover-up. I mean, when soldiers without uniforms marched into the Crimea. And announced that they were invading, or they weren't invading. There was maybe some kind of civil war starting, or they were just there to protect people. Quite a lot of people in the Western world were confused. So I was in London at that time, and I went repeatedly on television and the radio saying, "This is a Russian invasion force." And people said, "But how do you know? They're not wearing uniforms. Maybe they're Ukrainian separatists. We don't exactly." And for a good few weeks, actually, there was a lot of confusion, and they were very successful in portraying this invasion as a non-invasion. The other thing they were successful at doing was smearing the Ukrainians. They're Nazis, they're far right, they're ethnic nationalists. And there was a certain purchase for that view in mainstream circles in London and Washington and elsewhere. This time around, it's... What about in creating fissures between Eastern and Western Ukraine?
So Russia's been trying to do that for 2 decades. I mean, the point of Russian propaganda inside Ukraine was to create and amplify these divisions, whether they were over language or whether they were over interpretations of history and different ways of seeing the world. That has been their modus operandi there. And one of the effects of 2014 and the last 2 Ukrainian presidencies has really been to bring a lot of that to an end. And I think their invasion now is partly a recognition that the information war failed in Ukraine, and Ukraine was partly thanks to them. Ukraine was, unifying and rebuilding its state and rebuilding its army, and it was not so easy to divide it using sort of slander and political games as it had been before.
So let's go back to your journey. So you began paying a lot of attention to this, not just in all over Europe.
So we started, this was at a think tank. It was originally a kind of think tank program, and then we moved it to the London School of Economics. This is with my colleague, Peter Pomerantsev. And it's very interesting how it evolved. It's now, by the way, it's now at Johns Hopkins. It evolved as originally we were investigating how does Russian propaganda work, and we tried to track it in different ways. We worked with a lot of other different groups who were doing this. We tried to track it, we tried to understand it. We did a couple of publications on the Swedish elections, on German elections. And we also looked at various solutions, fact-checking and so on. And one of the things, though, that we pretty quickly learned was that fact-checking doesn't work. And it doesn't work because you have to trust the fact-checker. And if people don't trust the fact-checker, then they don't believe the fact-checker either. And so much of what we were talking about, in fact, was about, this was just alluded to as well, was about creating communities of trust. Mm-hmm. How do you build those for people?
And that's exactly what Maria was talking about in the project that she's working on in the Philippines.
Exactly. So how do you create communities of trust? And also, how do you get to the underlying problems of division and polarization? How can you heal polarization? How can you bring people together? Because if you want people to believe something that's true, you almost have to build a community around it. I mean, one of the other effects of it isn't just about the internet, but it is a sort of effect of trolling of all kinds, is that we've had, and this is beautifully described by Jonathan Rauch in his recent book called The Constitution of Knowledge. We've had a decline in belief in truth and facts and science more generally. So it's not just in politics. And part of that is to do with the fact, we don't think very consciously about why it is that we think things are true. But there's a whole ecosystem, here at universities, there's a scientific method, and there are peer-reviewed papers, and there are arguments among colleagues, and there is a conversation that leads people to conclude that something is true. And you arrive at it through a series of institutions, and that's true in journalism, it's true in academia, it's true in government. You have government, ombudsmen and inspectors and so on, and you reach conclusions based on these networks. If you disrupt those networks and make people feel no sense of faith in those networks, they hate universities, they hate journalists, they hate the government, they hate bureaucrats, then you suddenly find that what is true and what is not true is disputed. And so part of the solution to this problem, we want to get to that in a minute, is also, I think there are some regulatory solutions, but there's also a problem of recreating communities of trust, and this may be something that both media and philanthropy can think about.
Yeah, I want to get to solutions, but I want to continue on your journey, because part of that journey, once you formed this think tank and once you started doing these studies, was here to the U.S., and you met with policymakers within the government in 2016, and you tried to call their attention to.
This was slightly earlier. This was 2015, so it was before.
Even worse.
So before we did a big project that was an investigation into Russian disinformation, mostly in Central and Eastern Europe, and we pulled together all the existing evidence at that time, and we put it into a report. This was written by Peter Pomerantsev and Edward Lucas, another colleague. We put it into a report, and then we took the report to Washington, and we took it around, the Hill, and we went to the State Department, and we went, elsewhere, and we showed it to people, and we showed how it was working and how it was influencing politics and so on. And the reaction we got, and remember, this is April 2015, the reaction we got from people was, well, this is all very upsetting and distressing, and it's really too bad for Slovakia, that they have this terrible problem,
Yeah.
And we're sorry, about Slovakia, and maybe we'll think of a State Department project that can help the Slovaks.
Yes, this goes to your point about people, Maria, Americans tend to think they're immune.
Right. I thought Americans would be immune, and as the 2016 election unfolded, I watched kind of my jaw dropping as I saw Russian slogans that I knew had originated in the Russian media appearing in the U.S. election campaign.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about that. What did you see in 2016 that you thought was symptomatic of what you knew were patterns of behavior?
Well, there were several things. One of them was, literally I could follow. There were these slogans. Do you remember Hillary Clinton will start World War III. Obama created ISIS. You know, these were originally, these are kind of slogans and ideas that originally ran in the Russian press, and then Trump would use them in his campaign speeches. And so I could see this direct connection there, but there were also tactics that looked familiar to me. So again, this leak of you know, not very interesting people's emails from the Democratic National Committee. I mean, and then the spinning of those emails into a million different conspiracy theories. Actually, as nobody probably remembers now, Pizzagate was one of those. Pizzagate came out of the emails because some of the emails referred to meetings at a pizza restaurant.
This was the story about a pedophilia ring.
Right, and that was, and CP, which is cheese pizza, is meant to be a symbol for child pornography. And so people read into the emails this story about child pornography in this particular pizza restaurant in Washington. And as we know, at the height of the madness, poor guy from North Carolina drove up to Washington with a shotgun and came to the restaurant to free the children who were in the basement. Yeah. And then he discovered there was no basement.
Remind me to order sausage the next time.
Right, exactly. but the technique, in other words, create this idea that there is something secret has been revealed, and that, you know, and to then spin off. There was a kind of Catholic conspiracy theory that came out of that. There were a whole bunch of things. This is something I'd seen before. You know, almost. I mean, this happened in Poland. In 2014, 2015 as well. So I'd seen exactly the same technique before. So I knew somebody was learning something from someone.
Yeah, I should ask you, your husband was the foreign minister in Poland and is still involved a member of the European Parliament.
He's a member of the European Parliament.
Yeah. What was his experience like as a member of government?
Well,
senior member of government.
Right. So, you know, mostly his experience was very good, but he was famously taped at a restaurant, along with dozens of other people, and these tapes of conversations were released. And in none of the conversations was any crime committed. There was nothing illegal in any of them, but the off-the-record commentary was again, it was exactly the same thing. It was kind of twisted into, you know, complex conspiracy theories. And the tapes were made by somebody who had connections to the Russian coal industry.
And as you pointed out, you did studies in a number of different countries. What were the sort of threads of commonality that you saw between them?
I mean, so when you look at the, you know, Russian efforts in political campaigns, they're often very similar. I mean, in some European countries, they support both the far left and the far right, and to some extent, they may do that here too. It was a combination of funding for far right parties and sometimes particular people, or the creation of business opportunities for them. So people close, that one of the funders of the Brexit campaign, for example, in the UK, had a business opportunity created for him by the Russians. It doesn't mean he was bribed and he's not a KGB agent, but, you know, there were these opportunities would be presented to you. And this has clearly happened in the circles around Salvini in Italy and other places. You know, again, there was, you know, and then the disinformation tactics would often be about, you know, getting people to focus on whatever it was that made them afraid. So, you know, fear of immigration, fear of Muslim terrorism, which was very important in 2015, 2016 in Europe. Fear of immigration, even in countries that didn't have any immigrants. You know, one of the countries where this was done most successfully, and this was not Russian, this was his own thing, was in Hungary. Hungary is not a country with very many Muslim immigrants, but the fear that they were coming and this narrative about we need to protect Hungarians from this outside threat was extremely effective. And it was effective in other places too. Focusing on that, and focusing also in particular on kind of gender, LGBT culture wars, and looking for ways to divide people over those. This is something that the Russians have also consistently done inside Russia, but also in other countries. I mean, there was a very brilliant study that was done of Russian television, just like around about 2016, 17, 18, which looked at how Europe was portrayed on Russian TV. And the study found, you know, to make a long story short, that there were lots and lots of news articles and news items about Russia on the three main Russian channels, about Europe, sorry. And they were all negative. maybe one or two exceptions. And almost invariably the implication was Europe is degenerate, Europeans are afraid, and degenerate, crazy things are happening. You know, in Germany, gay couples are allowed to take children away from straight couples. You know, gay couples have more rights than straight people. You know, and sometimes these things would be based on real incidents, and sometimes not. But always the distortion was, you know, that there's a moral threat coming from Europe. But this is exactly the same kind of language that was used inside Germany or France. You know, there's a moral threat coming. It's an existential threat to your way of life. And it's connected to the institutions of your country and of your democracy. And so what you need to do is resist against those institutions.
You're talking about Germany and France in the 20th century or currently?
This is current.
Yeah, yeah.
This is great. I mean, another tactic that's very important and very important to understand how it's used is the tactic of conspiracy theory. And in some cases, the conspiracy theories have risen. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Usually they work because they play on something deeper and something real that people do fear. And so in this country, a very, very successful conspiracy theory was that President Barack Obama was born in Kenya, and therefore he's not American. And therefore, he's an illegitimate president. I mean, you will remember this very well.
I have a...
You remember that one?
I have some recollection of that, yeah.
So I didn't take it seriously as okay, some crazy people believe this. But up to 30% of Americans did believe it at some point or another. And think about, if you do believe that, think about what it means. It means our president is illegitimate. And that means that, you know, the White House and Congress and the FBI and the CIA and the media are all lying to us. You know, the institutions of the state have made someone illegitimate into the president. And that means that the whole system is rotten. You know, the whole country is falling apart. It's not what it's meant to be. It's been taken over by enemies, you know, and it's not real. It doesn't represent us anymore. And it was actually a very powerful and important moment of change, I think, in American public life. There's a very similar version of this that happened in Poland. It was a set of conspiracy theories around a plane crash that killed one of the presidents.
Yes.
For similar reasons, it had a very deep echo. You know, people in Poland were spooked by it. The crash happened in Russia. You know, had the Russians plotted it? Was there a cover-up, and so on? And this also had the same effect of undermining faith, not just that, you know, people thought something crazy had happened, but it undermined faith in the whole system. And so if you find the right conspiracy theory, and if it has enough purchase and enough, it echoes enough with things that people really are afraid of, then you can undermine people's trust in the democracy. And this is a tactic the Russians have used over and over and over again.
In that sense, the same dynamic that causes this to be a profitable strategy for social media platforms makes it a profitable strategy for political insurgency.
Yeah. No, I mean, and conspiracy theories spread because they you know, what the good ones do, some of them don't work, but what the good ones do is they seem to provide...
Now let's talk about good conspiracy theories.
Good ones, successful ones, well, what is the word? Effective ones.
Yes.
What they do is they seem to provide an explanation for mysterious facts, you know, or things that seem strange to people. And so they function, you know, as a story that connects something and that gives people this sensation, now I understand it. This thing that was bothering me that I couldn't understand, you know, how did a black person with a strange name become president of the United States? You know, that makes no sense in any piece of, you know, here's the explanation. You know, he's not really the president.
Yeah.
You know, or how did this plane crash kill the president of Poland? It couldn't have been an accident. Here's the explanation. There was a secret plot, you know, and they offer that, and people find it very satisfying, and they click on it, and they pass it on, and then, as Maria has just brilliantly described, the architecture of Facebook is such that the things that make people angry or afraid, right, or you know, are the things that move fastest across the internet.
Yeah, yeah. I want to leave some time for questions, so I should ask you. By the way, I should say parenthetically, the whole question of the legitimacy of the president is with us still.
Indeed,
in the
and not by accident.
Current in the administration. Well, let's talk about solutions. You started down that road, and Maria was very specific about her ideas about what we needed to do. You've done a series of studies. Your think tank, Arena, has done a series of studies. In each study, you offer prescriptions that suggest themselves from the research that you've done. Just first of all, briefly say, how do you do that research? And B, talk about the solutions that you think are most important.
So the research is always a group of partners, people who study the internet.
Multidisciplinary.
We usually try to bring together different groups. Sometimes we do a lot of polling, trying to understand division. Sometimes we use, people who can follow, Twitter bots across the internet. I mean, we've tried different kinds of things. So they're usually projects that bring people together. I should stipulate, this is fairly small scale. There are other people who do these things at a much bigger scale than we do. But the solutions, I think, go in 2 or 3 categories. And some of them, I think there is a regulatory solution. We're not there yet in that our Congress is not yet prepared to talk about it. Our lawmakers aren't yet there. 1 or 2 of them are, but not as a group. And this would be the regulation not of content. So we're not going to create a Ministry of Information that reads every Facebook page and takes things down, but it would be a way of regulating the algorithms. So at least opening up the black box, looking at what they are and how they work, and giving some people outside of the companies ways to understand that. And if you think that's impossible because the platforms are too powerful, remember that once upon a time it was considered impossible to regulate the food industry. And the food industry was only eventually regulated because socially concerned scientists began doing experiments measuring food, and then they began publishing the results of their work. And in some cases, they created kind of, newsletters or things focused at consumers. They raised public awareness, and now we have food regulation, in which we all think is totally normal, and it wouldn't occur to us that that we shouldn't have it. And so we're still at that phase. So we could get there. It's not technologically impossible, and there are scientists, internet, computer scientists who are working on this, in some universities. The second solution that is worth thinking about, and I'm sure this will come up again at this conference, would be putting a lot of thought into what would a public interest social media project look like. And by this, I don't mean like the BBC website online. I mean, what would, if you were to have online conversations that were good and useful and fruitful, how would they be designed? And what algorithms would they be based on? And what would they seek to do? And this is also a huge area of research and experimentation, and there are many examples, in fact, of people who've tried versions of this. So there have been, the Taiwanese are very interested in this for a lot of interesting reasons, obvious reasons. The Taiwanese are very interested in democracy and how to protect it, and they think about this a lot. And so, for example, the use of there's a platform called Polis, which is a platform where you can essentially hold an online debate, except that instead of producing everybody shouting at each other and being angry, it sorts people into groups and makes, so that you become clear where the areas of consensus are. So could you create consensus online? Could you find other ways of talking online? Could you create a social media that had slightly different rules? And the rules would, in the ways that you have rules for a town hall or rules for Wikipedia, which is a great example, actually. Mm-hmm. Could you have an online conversation that had rules? And maybe the rules would be that no one can be anonymous. Everybody has to be a real person, or at least be identifiable as a real person, so there are no bots. Maybe some of the rules are that when you post things, you have to wait 6 hours before it appears. There are a couple examples like that, so that when you are really mad and you post something, you have 3 hours to think about it and take it back. I mean, so, but you can imagine structuring something like that and having those alternatives. And there's something called frontporch.com in Vermont, which works a little bit like this. There are a few other things, and that the challenge would be finding ways to finance it, finding ways to persuade people to communicate on that and not on Facebook, and so on. But it's not impossible. And this is, again, a great area of really interesting research.
You mentioned Wikipedia significantly. It isn't supported by advertising.
Exactly.
And this is enormously lucrative. We'll be talking about this in great detail. So I don't have a lot of faith that the platforms are going to regulate themselves.
No, they will not. They will not. They could. They do know a lot about what spreads and what doesn't spread. Facebook has even told us, has even said that after January the 6th, they were much more cautious about what kinds of things they allowed to go forward and how information was spread. And when I heard that they'd done that, I thought, well, if they could do it at that moment, why didn't they do it before? So no, they are not going to regulate themselves. They don't have any interest in regulating themselves. Appealing to them to be nicer or more public-spirited seems quite pointless to me. And that's why I hope eventually we could get to a conversation about some kind of regulation. And because it seems to me that both, that there is a bipartisan interest in this, I think it's not impossible. Actually, Frank Fukuyama, I've had this conversation with him a couple of times, does think it's impossible. And so he has another idea, which is that at least we could create something called middleware, which would at least allow us to choose our algorithms. So we wouldn't all be subjected to the same one. So we would have some control over what kind of information we see. And that's another kind of technical solution.
I think I'm supposed to be going to questions now as the clock ticks down, so I don't want to deprive people of their chance to ask them. Raise your hand if you want to be heard. Yes. Also, turn on the microphone if you want to be heard. Still not.
We have an amplification issue, yes.
Yes. I don't think we can blame this on the Russians.
No, or Mark Zuckerberg.
There we go.
Okay. Thanks for doing this. I hope you do this every year, this conference. What has happened to the Republican Party? When you stop to think about what happened in the hearings for the Supreme Court justice and the kinds of questions that were asked, when you talk about some of what Ann mentioned about, Barack not being, an actual American president, when you stop to think about what actually happened on January 6th and what led up to that, back to my original question, what the hell happened to the Republican Party?
I'll let you answer.
I was going to say, I feel this is a question for you.
No, it may be a question for me, but I'm hoping you'll answer it. No, look, because I do not want this discussion to become a strictly a partisan discussion. One of the points that you're making here is that this is a global contagion. Maria makes that point. So it's not just about that, but you also said that there are entities and that emulate these tactics, that have learned from these tactics, and you've written about this.
Yes, no, I've written about it quite a lot. I mean, first of all, that point about this not being partisan is very important, because one thing that we should all be conscious of here in this room is that even a conference on the subject of disinformation will be understood in a partisan way by a part of the country, just like conversations about democracy are now understood as partisan in a part of the country. And the language that seems to us universal, that it should appeal to everybody, doesn't. And the divides in America are now so profound that we don't even agree anymore about what unifying language is. And so this conversation, is one that could and should be held with the whole political spectrum, but in practice it isn't. What happened to the Republican Party? I feel we need a different conference to discuss that at great length. But look, I mean, the Republican Party in some ways reacted to the changing nature of communication. I mean, this is one piece of the answer, and this is maybe the one relevant to this conference, in that a part of the party worked out that the way to reach people was through anger, division, and conspiracy theory, and that when they used that kind of language, it spread very quickly and became viral and appealed to people. And that and that was a formula for winning elections. I mean, there's another piece of the story which is about, gerrymandering, and there's another piece of the story about the U.S.
That is for another
Constitution,
conference.
And, there are other parts of the explanation, but one of the explanations is that it was a logical reaction to the nature of social media, and it was something that the right, not only in this country but in a lot of countries, learned how to take advantage of. That we're living through this period of unbelievably rapid change, social change and demographic change and economic change. And for a lot of people, that change is very frightening. And people aren't wrong, by the way, that some traditional ways of life are left behind, and things that they remember from their childhood don't exist anymore. And one of the things that the Republican Party did successfully was sort of weaponizing that nostalgia, and that belief.
But we should say, and I want to take this last question, the question from over here, but we should say that some of the themes that you articulated in other places were the same themes that were so powerful here with Republican or some Republican voters that helped propel the sort of populist right-wing.
Yes, no,
themes.
We had an enormous period of political change, and then we have a backlash as people are uncomfortable with the change, and a part of the party understood that and used it and deepened it.
Let's take a.
Amazing. Thank you for doing this. Really appreciate it. I'm Daniel Schmidt. I'm a freshman at the University of Chicago. My question is for Ms. Applebaum. So in 2020, you wrote, "Those who live outside the Fox News bubble do not, of course, need to learn any of the stuff about Hunter Biden," referring to his laptop, of course. A poll later after that found that if voters knew about the content of the laptop, 16% of Joe Biden voters would have acted differently. Now, of course, we know a few weeks ago, the New York Times confirmed that the content is real. Do you think the media acted inappropriately when they instantly dismissed Hunter Biden's laptop as Russian disinformation? And what can we learn from that in ensuring that what we label as disinformation is truly disinformation and not reality?
My problem with Hunter Biden's laptop is I think it's totally irrelevant. I mean, it's not whether it's disinformation or, I don't think the Hunter Biden's business relationships have anything to do with who should be president of the United States. So I don't find it to be interesting. I mean, that would be my problem with that as a major news story.
We're going to talk about more of this tomorrow in our first panel, so stand by. And I think we have run out of time. I don't want to be the one to hold up President Obama because I will hear about it if I do. But I want to thank Anne, and I commend all of her writing to you. You should read her Pulitzer Prize winning book, Gulag, and everything else she writes. And I think this gives you a sense of why you should be reading that. So thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, our program is about to begin. We ask that you kindly take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, our program is about to resume. We ask that you kindly take your seats. Please fill in all available seats.
See me back again. But I'm just here to introduce the speakers. Our next speaker is someone I've been talking with and to about democracy for 30 years, from the time he arrived here on this campus 30 years ago. And he was thinking deeply and speaking and writing about that then. He thought deeply and spoke and wrote about it during all his years in public office. He thought about it as a young man. He's thinking about it as as a gray-haired man. But I know the depth of his concern about this issue, and we're so honored to have him here with us. And he'll be in conversation with Jeff Goldberg, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. I should point, he is a world-class journalist, but he also heads a world-class organization, and the proof of it, at least one of it, other than reading their copy every day, is that last night they won the National Magazine Award for General Excellence, which is the highest award that you see. And part of the reason, a big part of the reason for it is the really incisive work they've done on this issue and all issues around democracy. So I'm really grateful to them. So I want to introduce Jeff and the 44th President of the United States, Barack Obama.
Yeah, you know, it's really amazing how popular The Atlantic is, you know. Thank you so much, really, for that warm greeting. Amazing.
That's worth a standing ovation.
Yeah, yeah. It's the National Magazine Award. It's not just a regional magazine award. It's the whole country. Thank you for coming and doing this with us. Thank you, David, wherever you went. This is a real privilege and an honor to have you here. And I think we're just going to jump right in.
We should jump right in. After I say hi to everybody, it's wonderful to see all of you, and congratulations to The Atlantic, because as somebody who's been reading consistently the work you've been doing, that was a well-deserved award. And you might have had a little bit to do with it, Jeff.
Go on. No, you could just, we could do 10 minutes on this if you want. I appreciate that, thank you. And not just a reader, but a subscriber.
That's correct, I pay for it.
And little known fact, one of our first subscribers, Abraham Lincoln. So good company, good company. Before we go directly into the subject of disinformation, there's a lot to cover. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about Ukraine, where we are right now. And something that I think everybody here would appreciate is the chance to hear you talk about this through the prism of your knowledge of Vladimir Putin. You spent a lot of time with him, a lot of time grappling with him. Spend a couple of minutes, if you can, explaining where we are and where you think this is headed.
Well, it is a tragedy of historic proportions. That's not news to people here. You can see it. I think that it is calling the question about a set of trends around the world that we've seen building for some time. Putin represented a very particular reaction to the ideals of democracy, but also globalization, the collision of cultures, the ability to harness anger and resentment around a ethno-nationalist mythology. And what we're seeing is the consequences of that kind of toxic mix in the hands of an autocratic government that doesn't have a lot of checks and balances. I think it is also fair to say that it is a bracing reminder for democracies that had gotten flabby and confused and feckless around the stakes of things that we tended to take for granted.
You include our democracy in that?
Yes, rule of law, freedom of press and conscience, of the sort that, you know, one of your previous speakers, Mayor Maria Ressa, represents, that you have to fight for that information, or you have to fight to provide people the information they need to be free and self-governing, that it doesn't just happen inevitably. Independent judiciaries, making elections work in ways that are fair and free. We have gotten complacent, and I think that I cannot guarantee that as a consequence of what's happened, we are shaking off that complacency. I will say that as somebody who grappled with the incursion into Crimea and the eastern portions of Ukraine, I have been encouraged by the European reaction, because in 2014, I often had to drag them kicking and screaming to respond in ways that we would have wanted to see from, you know, those of us who describe ourselves as Western democracies. In terms of Putin and where he takes this, there's been a lot of literature about this, a lot of reporting about this. I don't know that the person I knew is the same as the person who is now leading this charge. He was always ruthless. You witness what he did in Chechnya. He had no qualms about crushing those who he considered a threat. That's not new. For him to bet the farm in this way, I would not have necessarily predicted from him 5 years ago. How much of that is, you know, there have been speculation of the psychology of how much of that is him aging, him being isolated during COVID, et cetera. But as much as I think we cannot count on sudden rationality from him, and as disquieting as the absolute control of information within Russia makes me doubtful about any kind of grassroots or oligarch resistance to the current course of events. I think that what has happened in Ukraine in many ways is more remarkable than, or less predictable than Putin wanting to seize territory.
You mean the high level of resistance?
The high level of resistance, the degree to which you have somebody like a Zelensky responding to the moment. Part of what changed between 2014 and today is that I think a sense of national identity continued to fortify itself. And ironically, him lopping off, at least informally, annexing Crimea and portions on the east, I think clarified within Ukraine who they were and what they stood for. And I also think the thing that he did not fully anticipate is the degree to which the nature of war has changed, where everybody is seeing exactly what is happening on a real-time basis. And all those things, I think, may lead to, I won't say a happy resolution, but I think has the potential of preventing a maximalist victory for Putin, and that over the long term may allow for a independent Ukraine.
Two more quick things on this. Do you think that Ukraine can win by your definition of what win might be?
I mean, you look at these cities and you look at the populations and you look at the exodus. It's hard to describe that as a win. And I think it's too early to tell what an end game looks like. I would not try to predict not only what's in the minds of Putin, but also how the Ukrainians conceive of this struggle, because we are sitting here comfortably and they are going through heck. And the one thing I try not to do is to project onto them what they should do and what they should, how we should define what's tolerable, what the nature of the resistance should look like, how, if negotiations proceed, those should proceed. I think what we can do is support them and their efforts and their courage. And I think the other thing that we can do is take this as a lesson that sadly they're paying the price for, but that we still have, that speaks to a much more bumpy, difficult, violent, challenging future for the coming generation if we don't get some things right here at home, in Europe, and in Asia, in Latin America, because these are not, what's happening there is not isolated. What we're seeing is a reversion back to old ways of thinking about power and place and identity. And I think part of our complacency grew out of the notion that once the Berlin Wall fell and Mandela was released and the world was flat and you had McDonald's everywhere, and now suddenly that was it, and we were done. And we forgot that post-World War II 50-year stretch to 60-year stretch, that's the anomaly, right? And that there is millennia of brutality and pillage and violence and displacement and cruelty, we created a set of institutions out of 60 million people dying in World War II and tried to reconfigure how we might organize our societies, but it is not self-executing, right? It's something that we have to continually that we have to continually nurture and respond to new circumstances, whether that's changes in technology, changes in globalization, climate change. All those things require us to say, all right, what does that mean for our capacity to maintain human dignity and freedom and self-governance? And that's the prism through which we should be examining these questions and being willing to modify, adjust, reform our institutions to keep up with that. And that's something that I think we have not done as well as we need to.
One last question on this. Back in 2013, 2014, if you can go back and do things over again, would you have done more to work against Putin's aims in Donbass and Crimea? I remember, you and McCain going at it at various points.
Well, I actually don't, because the circumstances were different. The populations in Crimea certainly, and their attitudes towards Russia were different, which is why you did not have to have a full-scale invasion. The East was more complicated, and we had a very robust response that, as I said, required a lot of work with the Europeans in order to mount. And Ukraine itself was different. I mean, keep in mind that you had just had essentially a strong man who was aligned with Putin, and we had to intervene to prevent a massacre in the Maidan. The Rada still had elements that were linked to the old order. And so for us to check at least his efforts for 8 years, I think was what we needed to do at the time. The notion that we were also concerned about making sure that we did not give an excuse for a further incursion. And a lot of the arguments back then had to do with arming Ukraine, which in turn could have provided, those kinds of excuses, and you had issues of training. Anyway, if you ask me what I'm most concerned about when I think back to towards the end of my presidency, it probably has more to do with the topic here today. It's something I grappled with a lot during my presidency. I saw it sort of unfold, and that is the degree to which information, disinformation, misinformation was being weaponized. And we saw it, but I think I underestimated the degree to which democracies were as vulnerable to it as they were, including ours.
Well, let me ask you about something notable that's happening in Russia, which is that despite a somewhat porous internet, globalization, everything else, most Russians, from what we understand from reporting, seem to have very little idea that Ukraine is not the aggressor nation, that it's not run by neo-Nazis, and so on. And so my question for you has to do with how do you break through to authoritarian regimes or populations controlled by authoritarians to give them your understanding of reality, a democracy's understanding of reality?
Well, I don't think we have an easy solution. I mean, we have courageous journalists. You saw a woman with a handheld sign go across the TV screen saying this is all a lie, and it, that obviously got suppressed quickly. Here's one way to think about it, though. For all the flaws that may exist in our own society, you can get any information you want right now. It's in your pocket. Or some of you are taking pictures, so it's right in front of you. Unfiltered, literally, there's nothing you cannot receive right now in this room. And yet, in our society, you have currently roughly 40% of the country that appears convinced that the current president was elected fraudulently and that the election was rigged. And you have 30% to 35% of the country that has chosen not to avail itself of a medical miracle, the development of a vaccine faster than anything we've ever seen before, which, by the way, now has been clinically tested by about 1 billion people, and yet are still refusing to take it despite extraordinary risks to themselves and their families. So if that's true in our society, imagine how any of us would process information if we are not getting, if we're not seeing anything else, right? I have to be careful. The reason I'm pausing is I'm about to tell a dad joke. And so I'm sure my daughters, if they see this, will roll their eyes. But hey, it's like the old story of the old fish is swimming by a couple of young fish, and he moseys past him and he says, how's the water? And he keeps on swimming, and one of the young fish looks at the other and says, what's water? And I think that's how we are in terms of information, right? We don't know what we don't know. It's very difficult for us to get out of the reality that is constructed for us, and that is part of the reason why the stakes of this issue are so important, because it is difficult for me to see how we win the contest of ideas if, in fact, we are not able to agree on a baseline of facts that allow the marketplace of ideas to work.
I want to stay in this, and I want to sort of level set on some definitions. I just want to note for the record that that joke was 40% too epistemologically sophisticated to count as a dad joke, by the way.
All right, that's fair.
I have dad jokes we can do in our second hour, but go to definitions. Yeah. Let's just start there. All right. What is the difference between disinformation? I'm asking you this as a retired politician who uses facts or used facts to your advantage, your electoral advantage. What's the difference between disinformation and information that's narratively inconvenient, let's say? How do you define disinformation, misinformation?
I don't think the definitions are that tough. Misinformation is just wrong information, and that's always been with us. We get facts wrong, we say stuff wrong, and we're not going to solve for that problem anytime soon. The way I define disinformation is if you have a systematic effort to either promote false information, to suppress true information for the purpose of political gain, financial gain, enhancing power, suppressing others, targeting those you don't like, and that, I think, is entirely different from information that is inconvenient. If you're asking Jeff, but I'll use an example because I think it also shows that sometimes we get too cute about this, and we're not operating on common sense. I was born in Honolulu, Hawaii. There's a clipping there of me in the newspaper, dated 1961. I walked by the hospital every day for the first several years of my life. And so that's an example. That wasn't an example of people being misinformed, right? There was an agenda behind that promotion of what was clearly a false fact, right? I was identified as having engaged in a political falsehood when I said, we just celebrated the Affordable Care Act passage at the White House. I wasn't looking to milk any applause, but during the run-up to passage, in a speech before the AMA, I think, I said that, and repeated several times, that if you want to keep your doctor, you can. And the point we were trying to make is 85% of people had health care. One of the big problems in trying to get health care for the uninsured is making sure that folks who already had it didn't feel like, weren't vulnerable to scare tactics, that they were all going to be rationed and socialized medicine and they'd lose their plan to doctor. And we said, look, we're keeping the system for folks who have employer-based health care intact. Once we passed it and we were starting to implement, one of the things that we had done is to raise standards for what insurance could or could not provide, because there was a bunch of phony insurance on the marketplace that people thought they were purchasing insurance, but it turned out that when they actually got sick, there were so many restrictions to it, it didn't do them any good. And there was constant churn in this market. So when people were up for renewal for these ultra cheap insurance plans that didn't actually provide coverage, the standard we had set, it turned out they couldn't renew because those plans were no longer being offered. Well, many mainstream reporters, not just Fox News, said, look, he lied. You lost your insurance that you had and you were perfectly satisfied with. And I thought, well, I guess technically it's true that you no longer had the plan you had, because the bogus plans that you used to pay for that offered you no protection when you actually finally got sick, we regulated out of existence. That was deemed as I hadn't been accurate. That was one of the few times during my presidency where, everybody gave 4 Pinocchios on Obama. That's an example of what can happen in politics. And by the way, although I promise you I cursed a lot in the Oval Office when I read people saying that I had been mistruthful, or I hadn't been truthful, because the basic principle I had laid out I meant and was true, but I couldn't really complain about people criticizing me for it, and that's okay. But that was not a matter of us. Let me put it this way. Me saying that was not a threat to democracy. It was not intended to somehow subvert democratic process, and because people could then criticize me for it, the democratic process worked. That's how the marketplace is supposed to work in theory.
Can I ask you a meta question? Not a Zuckerberg meta question, a meta question. No.
Did you? Have you been holding that joke for?
No, 3 seconds.
3 seconds.
Seriously, it just happens. It's spontaneous. No. The meta question is prompted by your statement here. I'm wondering, given what you understand about the information environment, no one has been afflicted by some negative aspects of this current information environment like you have, the birth certificate being one example. You just kind of sort of admitted that maybe you didn't tell the whole truth, or you shared something that was inaccurate, and you just shared that publicly. Are you worried tomorrow that Fox News is going to say, Obama admits he lied about ACA or about keeping your own doctor?
I am now that you just said it that way. Because that is
I'm not trying to,
let me just be clear, that is not at all. I thought I was making the exact opposite point.
Yeah. No,
this is how the press works, even in a democracy.
Yeah. And by the way,
even with a award-winning magazine editor. No,
to make it meta. To make it meta, Brian Stelter is sitting over there already typing how he's going to report on this meta moment.
That is not the point I was making.
I'm just asking, though. No. I'm asking a serious question about.
And I'm going to respond. The point I was making is that the reason I brought up the point is that in a democracy there are going to be in the normal course of debate, we will contest what's been said, what's been promised, what's been delivered, and there will be some play in the joints in terms of how we interpret stuff, right? I actually, to this day, believe that what I said was accurate, which was when you say you can keep your doctor, if your doctor dropped dead tomorrow, that is not the fault of the Affordable Care Act. Technically speaking, you did not keep your doctor. You had to find a new one, right? So I was making a broader point, which is that systematically, we are not forcing you out of existing employer-based health care, which is what people at an aggregate level are concerned about. But the reason I told that story is to illustrate that, yes, there are still going to be disputes around what's true and false, even in a well-functioning democracy and a free press. That is okay. I was going to the point you were making, what's the difference between systematic disinformation, whether it's by the state or by product design on internet platforms, that are different in kind and are destructive in different ways. And you know, just to go back to basics, if you think about our constitutional design, and obviously even each democracy has sort of a different coding for how their democracy is supposed to work. But in our design, the theory is you have First Amendment, you have freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of the press, and everybody has a say. And in that marketplace, then we're going to sort out what's true and what's false, or what's best for us, how we act collectively, and so forth. In reality, as we all know, some voices have been louder than others, some voices were excluded entirely, but we did come to a point, let's call it post-World War II. Because prior to that, you know, sometimes we have a rosy, nostalgia about the past, and you have Father Coughlin, and you have the McCarthy era, and you've got the treatment of black people and brown people generally, and right. But at least after World War II, you had enough of a consensus that we built both a set of standards within journalism, and we built a set of regulatory guidelines that industries had to follow. And it was possible then to have a debate between the left and the right in which we differed strongly on process or on substance, but we agreed on process. And what we've seen is a breakdown of that consensus And what we've seen is a shift in technology and who controls these platforms in ways that are not transparent, and that has contributed to, aggravated, a sense in which we are no longer operating by the same rules or on the same facts.
I want to come to that because Maria Ressa talked very effectively about these questions about what the platforms.
I know she did.
But let me, there's a story that you have told over the course of your career. You wrote it. It was in the volume 1 of your autobiography. When is volume 2 coming, by the way?
Let's move on.
Okay. It's the story. It's a story. It's kind of an Iowa story, but it's also a downstate Illinois story. You talk about entering politics as a black politician, black Democratic politician from Chicago with a name like yours, getting a fair shake downstate. I think it's a great story, and I think you should tell about newspapers.
I think it speaks to the evolution of press and information and how it reflects on politics. And Axelrod will remember this. Because he was, let's face it, he was highly skeptical about the idea of me running for the U.S. Senate 2 years after 9/11 with a name that rhymed with Osama. And I can't fault him for that. So I'm going down to downstate Illinois, and those of you who know downstate Illinois, it's conservative. It's rural. It is conservative. 98% white, some of these counties. And I drive around, and for you young people, there were these things called maps that you had to unfold, and it was really hard to fold them back. So you'd swing into a town, and I'd typically stop. We'd arrange for me to stop by the local newspaper, and usually you'd have sort of a stereotype, but more than once. Bow tie, crew cut, glasses. Look at you kind of skeptically. Come on in, you want some coffee. Would organize a little round table with the reporters. And you'd sit there and you'd answer questions and bat some ideas around and explain why you're running for the Senate. And typically, the next day, there would be a little article, because these were small towns, so there wasn't much going on. So even though nobody knew who I was, they'd still report on it. And they say, well, you know, this young man came down, a little liberal for our taste, funny name, but he had some okay ideas, and he's running for Senate. And that was the extent of the filter that I was dealing with. And so then I'm going to the fish fry or the VFW hall or the county fair, and people might still be a little suspicious of a black civil rights lawyer from Chicago and whether they can connect with him. But I could get a fair hearing. There weren't a set of impenetrable assumptions about who I was. And as a consequence, I could win those counties, which I did. And if I went there today, I could not. Now, let me take myself out of the equation, because obviously I'm such an object of, people may have some fixed opinions at this point, I think it's fair to say. But someone like me going downstate or traveling through Iowa, they would have to work through a different set of barriers, because that newspaper probably doesn't exist. It's been replaced, by the way, not just by Fox in every barbershop and beauty salon or Sinclair local news, but it's also been replaced now with digital community newsletters that are being manufactured, printed out, and just pumped into these communities as local journalism has frayed. And by the way, I don't think there's an equivalence necessarily on the left and the right in terms of the media space, but I suspect it is also harder to get a hearing if you are a rural guy coming up to Chicago that doesn't check every box with respect to certain issues. Certainly if you're a conservative Democrat, let's say, who is coming up here running in a primary. So that, I think, is an indication of how things have changed. And by the way, there was just recently a report that confirms what I feel and what I've seen, and anecdotally, it's just one study that was done. Interesting study, though. They paid a pretty large cohort of Fox News watchers to watch CNN for a certain period of time. Do you see this? And it was, and these are very hardcore conservatives, not Biden voters, not central, sort of swing voters. These were folks who watch Hannity and Tucker Carlson and so forth. And after a relatively short period of time, what it showed is that their views on issues, controversial issues like immigration or police or vaccinations, had changed by 5, 8, 10%. Just simply by changing their diet. It hadn't turned them into liberals. It didn't make them want to vote for Joe Biden. They had just had access to a different set of information. And so I say that to suggest that I think we underestimate the degree of pliability in our opinions and our views. And what that means, I take that as hopeful, not in the sense that the divisions that we see in our democracy of race, of region, of faith, of identity, those are there. They are not creations of social media. They are not creations of any particular network. They're deeply rooted and they're hard to work through. But it does give me faith that if people are given different information, they can process differently. And that the stories they tell themselves about who they are and their relationship to their neighbors, their friends, people who don't look like them, people who don't think like them, that those are subject to well, to quote Lincoln, you can either encourage the better angels of folks' nature or their worst. And democracy is premised on the idea that we can come up with processes, including how we share information and argue about information that encourages our better angels. And I think that's possible.
But we stay on this newspaper question and journalism question because this is not a natural disaster. I mean, yes, there have been unique pressures that tech companies have put on newspaper companies, but Alden Capital, for instance.
Yeah, you guys did a great story about a venture capital firm that single-handedly scooped up and destroyed a whole bunch of newspapers in this country for profit.
It's a man-made disaster in some cases. What is your specific recommendation about these news deserts that have been created across the country? And you could fold in the tech companies and their responsibilities.
Why don't I step back just for a second and maybe just share a couple of assumptions that I have, in the interest of this transparency. Number one, as I said, I don't think that our media companies, our tech companies, social media created the divisions in our society. But I do think that what has happened in our media ecosystem is exacerbating and making democracy more difficult. Number two, I am close to a First Amendment absolutist. I believe in the idea of not just free speech, but also that you deal with bad speech with good speech, that you engage, that the exceptions to that are very narrow. And you know, particularly among this cohort of folks in college, and I've talked to my daughters about this, you know, I don't want us to be such a society of manners that like we feel like our feelings are hurt and we can't hear something that somebody says and we wilt. I think I want us all as citizens to be in the habit of being able to hear stuff that we disagree with and be able to answer with our words. Number three, I think that duplicating the consensus that we had post-World War II, and you had 3 TV stations and you know, newspapers in every major cities, in some cases like Chicago, multiple newspapers, and an FCC and all that. I think that's hard to duplicate, not just because of technology and the proliferation of content, but also because of the internationalization of content. That makes it more difficult. And number four, let's stipulate that there is no such thing as perfect objectivity. Right? New York Times, you know, obviously chooses which stories to write and which reporters to hire, and they have certain perspectives that, you know, reflect itself in their newspaper, and even AP and Reuters and UPI, same thing. But along with that, I would also argue that there's things that are more true and things that are less true. That the basic ideas of checking sources and having multiple sources and fact-checking and not reporting things that somebody just popped off and heard, and the value of, you know, expertise and science, that those things are important, right? And that you know, there are some areas that are not subject to fact-checking, and those are things we call opinions or faith or belief, and those are important too. Those speak to our emotions, but that is different from what in the public square we're supposed to be at least being able to find agreement on. So if I stipulate all that stuff, then what I would say is that the loss of journalism, or local journalism, the nationalization of sort of a grievance, anger-based journalism, the growth of social media and technology whose product design monetizes anger, resentment, conflict, division, and in some cases makes people very vulnerable, right? This isn't just words, but can lead to violence. And, you know, and it's not just, you know, the Rohingya in Myanmar. It's not just, you know, in some far-off place, right? But if you are a woman if you are a person of color, if you are a trans person right now in certain parts of this country, what's said matters. And what you now have is these product designs that are, and I think this was already said by Maria and others previously, in a non-transparent way that we don't have much insight to, a series of editorial choices are essentially being made that undermine our democracy, and oftentimes when combined with any kind of ethno-nationalism or misogyny or racism can be fatal. And that is the media ecosystem that we now are occupying. And the good news is I actually think that it is, at every juncture, every time you've had a new media, we've had this kind of churn, and then we've come up with rules to try to figure out how do we fix it. But in order to fix it, we are going to have at least a consensus about what's our North Star. What is the thing, the guiding principle around which we fix it? And my concern is right now that at least a portion of the country either isn't interested in fixing it or disagrees with what I would think our North Star should be, which is, do we have a free, self-governing society based on democratic principles?
Let me ask a self-described near First Amendment absolutist, how would you very specifically want to regulate social media companies to make sure that they're not privileging anger, privileging division and polarization through their algorithms?
So we've got a supply issue and we've got a demand issue for toxic information, right? And on the supply side, I do think that the tech companies are going to be increasingly the dominant players. They are private companies, which means that they are already making a range of decisions about not just what is on or not on their platforms, but also what gets amplified and what does not. And I think it is reasonable for us as a society to have a debate and then to put in place a combination of regulatory measures and industry norms that leave intact the opportunity for these platforms to make money, but say to them that there's certain practices you engage in that we don't think are good for our society, and we're going to discourage. And so a specific example would be, there's been a lot of debate around Section 230. I don't know that entirely eliminating Section 230 protections from liability is necessary. I certainly think that providing Section 230 liability for paid advertising that is micro-targeting certain groups and we have no transparency into, that's not serving any particular benefit in terms of startups or innovation or so forth. And that can be really damaging. So I think that we have to have a set of debates around that. And there are smarter people than me who are working on this. The issue of anonymity and the distinction between bots and humans or bot farms and people who actually have opinions. Are there ways of sorting that out? In some circumstances, it's important to preserve anonymity in terms of, so that there's space in repressive societies to discuss issues. But as we've all learned, it's a lot harder to be rude, obnoxious, cruel, or lie when somebody knows you're lying and knows who you are. And I think that there may be modifications there that can be made. So look, the one thing that's interesting, if you look at, for example, Facebook's response or Twitter's response or YouTube's response post-January 6th, they made a point of saying, well, we responded by doing a whole series of things, some of which then were reversed after the heat was off them, which tells me that they at least appear to have some insight into what's more likely to prompt insurrectionists, white supremacists, misogynist behavior on the internet, bullying behavior on the internet. They seem to know what it is. And I'm less interested in them, in fairness to them, many of them will acknowledge, we don't want to be policing everything that's said on the internet. But what they haven't been forthcoming about is what their product designs are, and there are ways in which a democracy can rightly expect them to show us. If not us, then a group of researchers. If they have proprietary concerns, that can be managed. But to show us in the same way that on any other product, like I don't know exactly how the inspections on meat are done. And if somebody says, well, we have a proprietary technique to keep our meat clean, that's fine. Take it up with the meat inspector. That's not my job. We can figure out how to, the same thing with cars, the same thing with toasters. This notion that somehow we have to preserve this information to ourselves because somehow we have proprietary interests, I think that's wrong. Now, that's on the supply side. I do think that there's a demand for crazy on the internet that we have to grapple with. And, part of the reason I'm spending more time thinking about this through the foundation is because I work with young people from across the country and around the world who are working on climate change, racial justice. Our goal in the foundation is to train the next generation of leaders and give them platforms and connections and make sure they're not isolated and that they're learning from each other across borders and regions. And uniformly, they're all confronting these issues about how do I deal with misinformation in my country, in my town? How do I get access to the public so that they know the facts that are affecting their lives about pollution or about how budgets are being distributed and so forth. And one of the things that we're learning is that they are hungry for a voice and for participation, but we haven't done a very good job in training this next generation to participate other than virtually and in a fairly shallow way. And part of, there have been interesting studies showing that the single biggest predictor of whether you're a regular voter, et cetera, is did you participate in student council, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts? And that's true for young people, it's true for all of us. The mediating institutions that used to lead us to be able to practice being involved and learning how do we debate and how do we vote and how do we then see results from collective decisions that we make. We're going to have to figure out ways to adapt that to virtual platforms because that's where people are going to meet and that's where people are going to be. And that may mean different ways of civic education, teaching critical thinking, finding better tools for participation on the internet, and that's all on the demand side. the good news is that we're seeing a lot of experiments being done. They just haven't been done to scale, which is why, as wonderful as it is to see exercises in virtual democracy developing in various countries, in towns, ways to get people to listen to each other and work together, we can't ignore the mega platforms that are out there because they're still dominating the space.
Let me, over the past couple of days, we've collected some questions for President Obama, and I want to throw two quick ones at you, and then a final question, a Maria Ressa-inspired question for you from me. This is from Ann Moss here at the University of Chicago. Was there a moment in your presidency you can identify when you or your advisors came to realize that social media itself posed a threat to American democracy? What was it? Was there a hinge moment when you just went, oh, what is happening here?
It's weird to remember that the smartphone came out in 2010. I mean, it's been 12 years since this ubiquitous thing came out. And so for us, what we saw was, I think you can draw a direct line during our campaign, Sarah Palin, birtherism, death panels. There was what's been called truth decay, right? There was an erosion of what was considered acceptable to assert in the press, period. That's all pre-social media. So what I did see was, I think, a erosion of accountability norms and standards
accelerated
in political life. And then when social media hits, then I think that you saw it spread and accelerate. But I wouldn't say that even by 2012 that social media was the main carrier. I think it was actually in my second term that you start seeing not just bad information, but you also start seeing an acceleration of misinformation. And by 2016, that's when I think we know what happened.
No, tell us. What?
Please.
Yeah.
One more question.
This is from Connor Lee, who's a student here at the University of Chicago. You've sort of touched on this, but it might be worth dilating on it for a second. What is your advice to young people who seek to play a part in protecting our elections and curbing the effects of disinformation on those elections?
Well, I think young people are going to have to help us reinvent for a primarily virtual social media space, the same kinds of rules, norms, practices, processes that existed before. And I think that's going to take a while. But you are going to have a better idea of what works and what doesn't to encourage veracity, accountability, the ability to listen to people who you don't agree with, to create those spaces. And so, through the foundation and other institutions, we're really soliciting from young people ideas and trying out a bunch of things. I think this is going to be, it's going to take some time. I don't think this is there are no silver bullet solutions to this, and I don't think that it's going to be solved in a year or 2 years or 4 years. I think this is building up the habits, the muscles of democracy, that have atrophied is going to take some time. But I'll close with what I said before. If you ask me how I'm going to sort through what are a set of genuinely difficult questions, technological questions, free speech questions, how do we encourage citizens questions? If you ask me, what's my guiding principle? My guiding principle is, does this make our democracy stronger or weaker? And when I say democracy, I don't just mean elections. Does this make a multiracial, vast, diverse country more likely to work together and to affirm basic notions of fairness, process, truth, or is it sending us in the reverse direction of tribalism, resentment, anger, division, and so that's what I'm thinking about. That's what I'm working on. And the reason that it's important for us to get this right, you started with Ukraine, I'll end with Ukraine. This is an international trend. And the one thing I'm here to report on about America is, for all the times we didn't live up to our ideals, for all the times that we've made mistakes on the international stage, or been hypocritical in terms of how we applied our faith in democracy. If we get democracy right, democracy is stronger around the globe. And when we don't get it right, or we don't look like we care about it, others fill that gap. People, even our enemies, recognize that what happens here, if we can make a democracy function where you look at this room and you've got people from every corner of the globe, every racial group, every ethnicity, every religion, every culture, that if we can figure out how to live together and treat each other with dignity and respect, then others start feeling like, well, maybe it's possible in our place, in our country too. And when we look like we have abandoned those ideals, or we're not willing to fight for them robustly, then around the world, people start saying, see, that was always a pipe dream, and the Putins of the world have a much easier time. So.
There are a dozen other subjects to talk about, but we're well out of time. And just a reminder that we're meeting here again at 9. We have an amazing program tomorrow, and I want you all to come. But in the meantime, please join, on behalf of David and the Institute of Politics, and on behalf of The Atlantic, please join me in thanking President Obama for his time today.
Thank you, everybody.
Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you kindly please remain in your seats for just a few more minutes. Thank you.